next door. Yep. Okay, well, welcome back after lunch. Hopefully you're not too full and too tired. If I see you starting to sleep, there might be random exercise drills just to make sure you're awake. So we're going to talk a little bit about reframing abuse and some of the ways in which we can do this. And some of you will have seen a shorter version of this yesterday at the Latvian conference, but this is a more expanded version. Basically, what I had said in the previous session as well is if you have questions, please ask as we go ahead. There is a microphone, so just stick your hand up. If you want to wait till the end, we'll wait till the end. And I promise I won't wander away from the microphone because I get a thumbs up from the translator at the back. I walked a lot earlier. They had no idea what was going on. So, okay. Just to start off with, one of the problems that we have in the sexual abuse field is that we don't necessarily understand the volume and nature of it. We have prevalence studies, but even then, that's not an accurate description because the vast majority of people don't report their sexual victimization. They either don't feel confident in coming forward to talk about it, they feel that they're at fault, that they're to blame, that no one will listen to them. So when we hear, especially from the press, but sometimes from politicians as well, that sexual abuse is on the increase, we have to take that with a pinch of salt. I would argue that it's not necessarily on the increase. We're just becoming more aware of the actual rates of sexual abuse. And in a lot of mainstream westernized countries, you have seen a number of things happen over the last few years that have prompted a dialogue in this. High profile cases, so like in the UK, the Jimmy Savile case, but also institutions. So the Catholic Church being held to account about the abuse that it has committed, but also statewide institutions, whether they're orphanages, whether they're hospitals. So more and more is coming forward. But what we're able to gather from prevalence studies is that we estimate that between 1 in 4 and 1 in 8 people have experienced sexual abuse at some point in their life, which is a massive number. And we know that sexual abuse affects people in lots and lots of ways. We know it affects their mental health, their well-being, their capacity to hold down a job, their future relationship status, also their future behavior. We know that being a victim of sexual abuse, especially in men, can be a predicating factor to going on and committing sexual abuse in later life. But for something that affects between 1 in 4 and 1 in 8 people, and it has this volume of consequences, the only other thing that really affects people in the same way, which affects 1 in 3 people, is cancer. But we don't talk about sexual abuse in the same way we talk about cancer. We don't fund it. And, you will hear this from victims advocate charities and from probation, that they don't have funding that reinforces the scale and nature of what they come into contact with. So what we're going to talk about today is actually maybe we're looking at this from the wrong angle. We spend a lot of time talking about this as a criminal justice issue. And actually, maybe that's not the best approach to take when thinking about sexual abuse. Maybe we need to think about sexual abuse as a health issue, because that opens up many more doors in terms of what you can do, in terms of how you can do it. And, if anyone, has ever worked in probation or worked with offenders, you know that it's hard to have that conversation about integration in a non-risk management way, because all people want to hear is that the offender will go to prison and that someone will be keeping an eye on them. And you're like, that's fine, but we don't have that volume of funding. So what are we going to do? So I think this really speaks to the problems of prevalence. So this is from the Office of National Statistics, the Ministry of Justice, and the Home Office in the UK. And they did a piece of work where they progressed the transition of people who commit sexual offenses through the criminal justice system. Okay? So here we have stuff on the number of offenses. So they estimate that between 430 and 517,000 sexual offences occur every year in England and Wales, which results in 5,600 convictions. And people drop out during the way. They maybe don't go to the place, or maybe the police don't think they have enough evidence, or the CPS doesn't want to pursue it, or there's other issues. So when we talk about understanding people who commit sexual offenses, We're talking about this group. So we are. Most research and evaluation is done on known offenders who have been to prison. I don't know if you noticed, but most of research is done on known Western white offenders. And this comes back to something that Imans talked about earlier, that can we generalize a lot of these stuff? Is the group of offenders that you're maybe seeing in Latvia or other European countries the same and have the same risk factors as Australians and people from the US and people from the UK? And what we need to think about is how we take this information and contextualize it and make it about sharing good practice and being able to say, you know what, this is interesting. How would this work in our context? What do we need to change about this? But the other thing that this does is we hear lots of calls for the registry and lots of calls to know who and what and where sexual offenders are. So a lot of this came from the US, and it came from initially Jacob Wetterling and Adam Walsh. And the registry was supposed to be for law enforcement and probation, that when there was a high-profile case, law enforcement would know who and where their known offenders were. Then it became about public knowledge and knowing if the person next door to you has a sexual offense, and that somehow the public become responsible for their own safeguarding. But some of the issues with this are, if this group here are the ones that we know about and the ones on the register, that's a fraction of this group. So how does knowing where this group is protect you from this group? It's a bit of a false economy. But that's not saying that the register isn't important. I do believe in the register. I just think that it shouldn't be about community notification. Because, yeah, you're told that your next door neighbor has committed rape. What are you going to do with that information? How is that going to make you safer? How is that going? Are you going to move house? Are you going to confront your neighbor about it? So we have to think about these things. And I know the register is something that appeals to people, and it appeals to politicians, because then they can say that they're doing something proactive. But I think we just need to take a pinch of salt, because our prevalence and our understanding isn't based on the volume of known perpetrators that we have. The other thing is, and you've probably seen this yourself, most perpetrators, when they come into contact with the system, are unknown to the system at time of arrest for sexual abuse. They might be known for antisociality, they might be known for other social problems, but they're not known sexual offenders, because we do a good job of keeping an eye on those that come out of the back end of the system. So I think it's always important just to think about the utility of things like the register, and knowing that are to help law enforcement, but they're not to solve public risk management problems. That's not what their role is, and they shouldn't be thought of in that way. So the NSPCC did a bit of work on this, and they basically said that sexual abuse affects people across the board. And the logic for this was actually politicians and policymakers respond to cost saving. As it has been in Europe for the past 15 years or 10 years, we are in a period of austerity. And you will often hear this when it comes to budget planning rounds, that you can't have more police officers, or we have to reduce the number of probation because we just don't have the resources to do this. So a really good example of this was in the UK, there is a guy called Simon Bailey, who's the police lead for sexual offences. And he came out about 9 months ago and basically said the scale and volume of child exploitation images is so high, we can't police our way out of this. We simply can't arrest everyone that has got it, because our jails would be overcrowded. So what are we going to do about it? We need an alternative solution. And he was crucified in the press. The police are soft on criminals. The police are soft on people who download images. But that's not what he was saying. What he was saying was, we can't do this through the traditional criminal justice approach anymore. We have to think of alternatives. And I can imagine if you were thinking about it in the countries where you work, that actually the volume of images and the downloading of images is far greater than your capacity to incarcerate and risk manage every single person, put them on the register and follow them for 20 years. It's not cost effective. So the NSPCC did this piece of work where they tried to work out the physical cost of sexual abuse. And so they looked at health, including mental health, suicide and self-harm, adult mental health, the criminal justice system costs, child social care costs, and labor market productivity. And so that's things like, actually, you've been a victim of sexual abuse, so you can't hold the job down. You take extended periods of sick leave because you're trying to negotiate what happened to you. But it also means you've got a conviction for sexual abuse. They can't find you a job. They can't find an appropriate place of employment for you. And so they estimated the overall cost to be between 1.6 and 3.2 billion pounds per year, which is a massive amount of money. What I would take from this is, given the context that we have said that this is a life course issue, and this is a health issue, what you're talking about is an epidemic and a public health problem. And we as a society need to be able to conceptualize this differently. This can't simply be about after the fact. We have to work at preventing sexual abuse. We have to be able to intervene before it gets to the point where we have got a victim and a perpetrator and they are in the system. Because it's just not time effective and it's just not cost effective either. So how do we construct these things? Because the physical acts aren't constructed. Rape, inappropriate sexual touching are real. They are physical acts. You can't take away from them. But we can change the narrative and the way that we talk about it. That is something that, like my old boss used to say, that is within our gift. We can do something about that. And I do think that as professionals, we have a role to play in this. Quite often you will hear professionals saying, well, it's not really my job to talk to the public or to talk to the press. That's not what I'm here for. But as people who work in the field, I think we do, because otherwise, who is having that conversation? Either nobody or the wrong person. I'm sure that you all have talking heads in your countries. When they go on the media and the press, you're like, oh God, here we go again. And they don't give the full story. And actually, probation is quite bad for this, and so's the police. No comment. We don't discuss individual cases. We don't talk about this. And do you know what that means? Yeah, you don't talk about the bad stuff, but you also don't talk about the good stuff. For every high-profile failure, there are thousands of people being managed effectively in the community, but all people hear about is the negative consequences when risk management goes wrong and people are held to account for it. So how do we construct these things? Well, it's a combination of personal factors, systematic factors, and societal factors. And these three things come together and they drive the political and social construction. But these are all things that we have influence over. So systematic factors like the criminal justice system, ideas about rehabilitation and reform, the evidence base, and we'll talk a little bit more about the evidence base, and actually we'll talk a little bit about policy. And when it comes to sexual abuse, we are in this strange limbo where you've got an evidence base and you want to use it, but it's also quite ideologically driven. And it's about gut emotions. And you see it with crime. So there was a famous Labour manifesto back in the 90s, which talked about tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. And you will see politicians and MPs will want to be tough on crime and will push a punishment agenda. But you know what the problem with the punishment agenda is? It's really expensive. If you send more people through the system, you need more prisons, you need more police, you need more probation officers to manage the people that you push through the system. So it's not an inexpensive option. Community and professional engagement and recording, with societal factors being social networks, social and cultural attitudes, political systems, the media, education, social welfare, and concepts around social justice. And then personal attitudes, vicarious attitudes, and what you experience. So what are public views? Well, to be frank, public views are a bit of a mess. So they want more punishment. They want people who commit sexual offenses to be sent away for longer. They want them, when they come out, not to go back into communities and neighborhoods where they live, but the public support treatment, which is strange. Because if they're more punitive and they want people sent away for longer, you would suspect that they don't support treatment, but they do. And do you know what group they really support treatment for? Youths. If you want to have a conversation about how to change perceptions and management of sexual offenders, the place to start is with youths. The public belief that youth can change in a way that they don't believe that adults can change. If you have a conversation about maybe a 13 or 14-year-old who has committed rape or other form of sexual abuse, it will be a very different conversation. It will be a conversation about their family, their upbringing, their context. Where if you have it about a 45-year-old or a 50-year-old man who sexually abuses a 6-year-old girl, that'll be a different conversation. Oh, he's sick, he's evil, he's depraved. So the nature of the abuse and the perpetrators of the abuse change the story and change the narrative. And actually that's quite important when you start to think about how can we reframe some of these questions and how can we make this more health and life course orientated. So what this means, when you have big cases, you have bad policy. And let's step back from sexual offending for a minute. I'm sure you've all seen big cases in your country. In the UK, we have one at the minute. It's called Brexit. It's a frigging disaster. But there is a reaction to high-profile cases where the government will step in and say, we need to do something, and we need to do it now. And anyone who's ever worked in policy or practice know that you don't make big decisions quickly. So bad policy is often driven by an instant response to a big problem. And actually a good example of the opposite of this was in the UK, we brought in the sex offenders register, and it was driven by actual professionals. Professionals wanted to register. And then we had a big case called the Sarah Payne case. And Sarah Payne was 8 years old, and she was abducted and killed by a known sex offender called Roy Whiting. Now, what had happened was an unfortunate set of circumstances. She was at her grandparents' house. She was playing in the fields with her siblings. Roy was from a different county, a couple of counties over, and was driving past and spotted her and grabbed her. He didn't go out with the intention of abducting someone that day, but that's what happened. And there was a big campaign by the News of the World that actually we need to know where all sexual offenders are, and that needs to be public knowledge, like in the US, with the idea that that would have saved Sarah's life. But unfortunately, that wouldn't have saved Sarah's life, Because even if they had have checked their local area, Royal Whiting wouldn't have shown up on the database for a start. So what the UK government did is it spent 10 years thinking about community notification and whether they should do it or whether they shouldn't do it. And ultimately, they decided to have limited community notification because they didn't want to have unfettered access to material. And you saw, and then it came in England and Wales, and it was led by the police. In Scotland, they said, actually, maybe the police aren't the people to lead this. Now, the first time they introduced it in Scotland, it backfired a bit for them because they did it through social workers. And there was really poor take-up, and no one could understand why there was a poor take-up. So they did some research. And I'm sure you can imagine what the public said. Social workers take children off bad parents. And you want me to go and say to social workers that I think my child is being sexually abused. They'll think I'm a bad parent. And that hadn't occurred to them. And so what they do now is Stop It Now Scotland, which is a victims charity. They run the community notification scheme in Scotland. Because there was this idea that people would trust a charity, especially a victims charity, more than they would trust the state. But that came about because people took the time to think about the actual implications of policy and practice, and they didn't rush into introducing a new policy straight away. So we've talked a little bit about this, but there is a perfect storm around sexual violence at the minute. It's everywhere. There's been an increase in reporting, which we have talked a little bit about up until now. It's also in the press. Certainly in the UK, but I can imagine in most other countries, you can't go a day without reading in somewhere in a newspaper a story about either rape, child sexual abuse, paedophile rings, child trafficking, exploitation. It's everywhere. We're talking about it more. More victims are coming forward. The CPS is taking it more seriously. So in the UK, there has been an increased trust in the police and an increased trust in the criminal justice system because the criminal justice system has came out and said, we will believe you. We will be more accepting of cases coming to court. Now, that's great, but we still have work to do around this. I don't know if any of you saw the case in Ireland earlier in the week. So there was a case thrown out of an Irish court, and it was a jury court, because basically the defense argued, the defense argued that the victim had given their consent because of the nature and type of underwear that they were wearing. And if they hadn't have chosen that underwear, they wouldn't have been signaling them that they were up for sex. And it really shows how prevalent rape myths are within our criminal justice system and within our jury system, and we need to do more work around that. I thought we were past this. I thought we were past where you went and how much you had to drink and what you wore meant that you were more likely to be consenting to sex, and obviously we're not. And the impact of high-profile cases. But one of the challenges is, in this current day and age, I often get concerned that risk management becomes about audit cultures. So with more people coming through the system and less funding available for offender management, but also for policing and probation and charities, more is expected to be done with less resources, but standards aren't expected to drop. And that becomes a real challenge. If your caseload goes from 10 to 40, you can't give 40 people the same detailed response that you could give to 10. And that, that's just logical. That's just simple. But what you end up seeing is it has two impacts. The first one is burnout. So a colleague of mine did a piece of work where she looked at resilience among social workers. And across Europe, they found that 50% of social workers left the profession within 3 years of qualifying. They were just burnt out by it. And if you looked at probation, you would see similar things. You see a large dropout early on because people go into it expecting certain things, and then they get their caseloads, and then they get their families, and then they get their complex individuals, and they struggle with that, so they do. But the second thing is it becomes about an audit culture. Risk management should be about public protection. It should be about protecting the public, making sure that the individual under supervision is doing what they're supposed to be doing, the victims are protected. But what you see now is a lot of audit culture where risk management becomes about managing the risk to the operation and managing the risk to the organization. So how do we make sure that if something goes wrong, we're covered? How do we make sure that we can defend every decision that we do? And that's not a problem. There's nothing wrong with being defensible. But when it gets in the way of innovation, when people are less likely to take chances because actually we don't know what the outcome of this is going to be, and less likely to challenge problematic behavior in new ways, that does become a problem. Risk management should be about innovation and adaptation. It shouldn't be about organizational safety and keeping organizations protected. So what this means is when we do this, when we think and we use the evidence-based, and I'll come back to the evidence-based in a bit, we get realistic, connected policy that's thoughtful, and we get a positive, inclusive, informed debate. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to talk a little bit about prevention, and then I'm going to talk through 10 key ways that we can change the nature of the conversation and what that looks like. So at the minute, we tend to think of sexual abuse and sexual harm as a criminal justice issue. And that's problematic because it's after the fact. You've got a victim, you've got a perpetrator, the damage has been done, and it's up to us to sort out the damage. It's to help the victim get back on track and help them deal with what's happened to them, to punish and manage the perpetrator and reintegrate them back into society. But the other thing that is problematic is it focuses on identified victims and perpetrators. So you've got a victim and you've got a perpetrator. It's not about society. It's not about cultural ideas. It's not about the way that we think about trauma. It's not about the way that we think about adverse experiences. It's about two individuals. And actually, sexual abuse is bigger than individuals. So it allows us to construct the perpetrator as being radically different from the rest of us, and the victim for being unfortunate and being at the wrong place at the wrong time. And not about actually how we think about victims or how we think about perpetrators. It's punitive. There's always a criminal justice response tied into it. It's either prison or community sentencing. And the police and the system are the main agents. However, if we flip this, and if we're saying that sexual abuse is a health issue, it's a life course issue, it affects people, both victims and perpetrators, in a lot of different ways, then we can be proactive about it. We can be preventative. One of the things that we're abysmal at as an industry is preventative practice. We are really good when people come out of prison, especially offenders, at managing them. We've got multi-agency task forces, police talk to probation, who talk to housing, who do all this wonderful stuff. But at the front end, we're not very good at schools talking to social work, talking to the police. When we do, it's when something goes catastrophically wrong, a student's been excluded, or there's been a problem with the place and they've had to come and deal with a family. As a baseline, we don't do it as a matter of course. We only do it when there's a significant problem. But this means that it's focused on communities. So sexual abuse happens within communities, but communities can also prevent sexual abuse and challenge sexual abuse. It's focused on potential victims and perpetrators, and it's led by education and health as well as the place, because we need a more rounded, holistic approach to this. So, public health talks about prevention happening in 4 ways. And we do a lot of primary stuff. So primary stuff is large scale social advertisements and broadcast messages. So you can probably think of charities in the countries where you live and work. Anti-sexual abuse, report sexual abuse, be aware of the signs of sexual abuse. It's like drink and drive adverts at Christmas. You see them and they're everywhere. It's those broad-based messages of keeping yourself safe, being aware of what's going on around you. And we're quite good at that. What it's also about is going into schools, talking to children, talking to communities about sexual abuse. I had an interesting one the other day where I was asked to come and talk to our HR department about sexual abuse and how they can convey to staff what's appropriate behavior and what's not appropriate behavior. So it's those broad-based institutional and public messages. There's quite a lot of them out there. Secondary, we don't do very well. Oh, sorry.
And going to the school, so think how old are the children when you talk about this?
So, generally speaking, what you end up seeing is that primary schools do some basic stuff, but it's sort of like stranger danger, good touch, bad touch, and stuff like that. Secondary schools do a lot more, but I think we've got it the wrong way around. If you're not educating people about appropriate sexual behavior in primary school and waiting till they get to secondary school, that ship has sailed. We hear a lot about toxic masculinity and the problems of pornography. Children will find a way to find this information out. And my argument is, wouldn't you rather hear it from a responsible adult that they know rather than them finding out about it on the internet? But a lot of schools are scared to teach about this to primary school. They think that they're going to open up the door to victimization. But the reality of it is, there are children experiencing this, and the children who need to have the conversation aren't getting it at home. And school is the lowest common denominator. Up until a certain age, everyone goes to school, or they should at least go to school. And this message needs to be framed within that. So what we're starting to see is certainly in the UK and places like the US and Canada and Australia, that schools are getting more proactive, but there's still a strong conservative edge that they don't want to teach this stuff. But they're starting to realize that actually they do. And what they do is, the schools don't do it. They bring in charities and NGOs to do it. And that helps. So the secondary approach, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this later on, is working with at-risk populations. So people who identify as being pedophilic, people who identify as being at risk of committing sexual abuse or sexual assault, people who are worried about their behavior and getting them to come forward and seek help. Now, the best example of this is Project Dunkelfeld in Germany. And it has 10 walk-in clinics spread across Germany where people can walk in and get free, anonymous, confidential help with their sexual desires. Now, there's a couple of things that I have to say about this. The first one is, Germany doesn't have mandatory reporting. So you can go to a clinician in Germany and say that you've committed sexual abuse or that you're thinking of committing sexual abuse, and they don't have to tell anyone. That's the first thing. The second thing is, in Germany, this becomes a mental health problem. So you may be pedophilic, or you may be wanting or thinking about committing sexual abuse, but they will bring you in and have the conversation about it being about depression or anxiety. They will deal with the mental health problem first and then deal with the sexual abuse. And we know that this doesn't often translate into other countries. So, for instance, in the UK, if you went in and said you committed sexual abuse, that would be passed on to the police. Or if you said that you've been sexually victimized, if you name the perpetrator, that would be passed on to the police as well. So it's quite challenging. But what we're starting to see is that there are charities starting to do this work. So there's an organization called Stop Sexual Offending in the UK, and it's a collection of therapists and counselors who volunteer their services so that people who think that they're going to commit sexual abuse can get anonymous help. There's also the Lucy Faithful Foundation and Stop It Now, which have a call-in line. However, if you call in multiple times, you're not guaranteed to get the same person on the other end of the phone. So there's no continuation of care. And so it really depends on who you get. One of the really interesting ones is a Lucy Faithful one. So going back to what Simon Bailey said previously about the existence of child sexual exploitation material online, Lucy Faithful and Stop It Now have an online resource. So say you're looking at websites with inappropriate images of children on them, a redirect will come up saying, do you understand the consequences of the material that you're viewing, both on you and the victim? And it will redirect the person to the site where they will go through an anonymous online module explaining the reality of child sexual abuse, child exploitation material. And to really highlight the significance of this, I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and it had just been running for about 9 months. Within the first 9 months, the website had over 1 million hits. And that really enforces what the police were saying. You can't put all of these people in prison. The system will collapse under the weight of it. So we do have to think outside of the box. So there's some interesting things happening around secondary, but it is still in its relatively early days. But if we know the risk factors, which we do, and we know some of the problems with people who go on to commit sexual offences, we should be taking secondary prevention more seriously, because we might be able to prevent some of the sexual abuse that occurs further down the line. Tertiary, we do all the time. In health, it's called relapse prevention. We call it sex offender treatment. And so it's treatment programs and management programs that are based around stopping people from reoffending and enabling people to integrate back into the community in a safe and coherent way. So there's a relatively new one that's emerged on the scene in the last couple of years, and it's called quaternary prevention. And it's really about action taken to protect individuals from interventions that are likely to cause more harm than good. And we know a lot of the policies and practices and stigma around sexual abuse cause re-entry problems. Whether it's about getting a job, whether it's about finding accommodation, whether it's about registering and what gets registered. Maybe you're dealing with an online offender who can't have a mobile phone or can't have access to technology. And just think about that for a minute. Can you imagine trying to get a job in today's society and having no technology available to you? Everything is online. So this poses real challenges to some of these individuals. So you have things, and I would argue that circles of support and accountability is one of them, that looks to reduce some of these negative consequences through engagement with the public, engagement with the community, and cross and multi-agency working. It reinforces in people that actually there are mechanisms there to support and to help them, and aids their proactive reintegration. But this is what we need to be thinking about across the board for both victims and perpetrators. So in primary phases, we do that for both victims and perpetrators. Secondary is bad for both. Sometimes social work is really good at tapping into victim narratives and understanding who potential victims are, but quite often not a lot is done. We need more resources for tertiary for both victims and perpetrators. And from a victim's perspective, there's a lot of charities and there's a lot of goodwill around helping them deal with their sexual abuse. And society is very open to supporting victims, but we need to do more around perpetrators. So this was a study that we did through the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers. If people want a copy, I'm very happy to give them a copy of the report and anything else. At the end, I'll put my email address back up again. Feel free to email me. But I know CP is going to put this stuff online. So this was across 17 countries, including Australia, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, Germany, Ireland, Israel, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Puerto Rico, Singapore, Sweden, Switzerland, the UK, and the US. And we're asking a whole load of questions, actually. We were looking at risk management. We were looking at risk assessment. We were looking at collegiate support. So like, do you feel that your organization supports you and gives you help and advice? But there was questions on prevention. So when we asked them, what is is your government's attitude to sexual abuse preventative? The vast bulk of them disagreed. 25 of them disagreed, where only 16 of them said, yes, actually it is prevention orientated. They basically went on to say that it's quite punitively orientated and popular and populist orientated. They feel that their colleagues, 42 of them felt that their colleagues understand the prevention of sexual abuse. But a combined 49 went on to say that either they weren't sure or they didn't think that the public was aware of sexual abuse prevention and it could be prevented. So what this shows us is we need to move the conversation out of talking with our colleagues about it and move that in to policy and practice in the government, but also move that into conversations with the public about how we can prevent and how sexual abuse is preventative. So I'm going to talk through a couple of examples of this now. I think this highlights the problem very well in a couple of ways. So this really talks about how we think we're talking about the same thing all the time. And this guy here is going, thank God there's a boat. I'm getting off this island. I'm getting to go home. And this guy's going, hey, there's an island. I get to get off this damn boat and get on the dry land. But they're not talking with the same objectives. They're not wanting the same things. And so we did a piece of work a couple of years ago with the police, looking at police attitudes to risk management and risk assessment. And we did the same thing, and we're doing the same thing currently with probation and the prison service. When we talk about risk, we're all assuming that we're on the same page, and we're not. The police think about risk in a different way to how probation think about risk, to how schools think about risk, to how public think about risk. And I think we need to have this common dialogue. We need to come together and set some ground rules about what it is we're talking about. Because how can we work together effectively if we're not talking about the same thing and we don't have the same end result in sight? The second thing is about the language that we use. And this covers a couple of points. The first one is, why do we call people by the thing that we don't want them to be? We have spent such a long time telling them, we don't want you to sexually offend. We don't want you to do this stuff, but we call them sex offenders. And to me, the significance of this is, if everyone just takes a minute and thinks about the worst thing that you have ever done in your entire life to somebody else, how would you like everyone to know what that is and then call you by that on a daily basis? It wouldn't improve your self-esteem. It wouldn't encourage you to integrate. And actually, it goes against treatment. If treatment is strengths-based, and if treatment is about getting people to change their attitudes and behaviors, if you confront them with the idea that no matter how they change, you're still going to call them by the same thing. In criminology, we call that labeling. And we know that labeling has a massive impact upon reduction in reoffending. The other thing that we also talk about is the idea of, is it violence, is it abuse, is it harm? And I've heard stories from a lot of survivors and victims who say they didn't come forward because they weren't a victim of sexual violence. He didn't rape her. He did other things, but he didn't rape her. And it's like, okay, so maybe the language that we use is important. So there's a famous UK criminologist called Paddy Hilliard, and he talks about xenology, which is the study of social harms. And he says that you can get past harm. Harm as a label is easier to get past. It's easier for victims and it's easier for perpetrators. So maybe we need to be thinking of talking about people who have committed sexual abuse or people with a sexual offense history and harmful sexual behaviors. And it's worth thinking about this because it really feeds back into how we integrate people back. The other thing is the service user voice. If we're serious about this being a health issue and reframing this, patient and public involvement and the service user voice is massive in health. You would never get funding to do a clinical trial, or you would never get funding to do research or practice in the medical field if you didn't have a service user involved in it. But we do lots of stuff with prisoners and offenders, and we don't listen to their voice. And we don't really want to listen to their voice. And especially with people who commit sexual abuse, we are constantly told that they lie, that they're manipulative. And yes, they can be, and some are. However, if you genuinely believe that everything you are told is a lie, what is the point of treatment? What's the point of doing anything at all if everything they say is going to be a lie and you can't trust them? So we need to think about how we hear the service user voice and that we engage in doing stuff with them rather than to them. And the natural extension of this and of the service user voice is that ultimately research and evaluation in this area is very practical. Does the intervention do what it says? That's what research is about. However, we spend very little time talking about the impact of the intervention on the person who's experiencing it. And one of the challenges for us in this field is that a key performance indicator of a success of treatment is recidivism, and actually is reoffending the natural outcome of treatment. Behavior change is the natural outcome of treatment, and that can be reoffending, but it's also more than reoffending. Have they had greater social inclusion? Have they engaged more? Have they got a job and held it down? Are they able to function? Has their risk level dropped? All of these are equally as important as whether or not they've reoffended. So the other thing is an emerging field of research on adverse childhood experiences. So adverse childhood experiences are experiences that children go through in young life and adolescence that impact them later in life. And so a lot of research has been done on this in Wales and in Scotland. It's actually reached a policy level where Welsh and Scottish government policy includes adverse childhood experiences. In Northern Ireland, they're interested in it, and it is prevalent, but it hasn't got to a policy level. And in England, it's very hodgepodge. If you go to different areas, you will find it, but you won't find it everywhere. So what are adverse childhood experiences? Verbal abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, parental separation, domestic violence, mental illness, alcohol use, drug use, and incarceration. In the Scottish study, which is this one here, I'll read this out because I think this is important. So if you have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, so these down here, compared to people with none whatsoever, you're 4 times likelier to be a high-risk drinker, 6 times more likely to have caused unintended teenage pregnancy, 6 times more likely to smoke e-cigarettes or tobacco, 6 times more likely to have had sex under the age of 16, 11 times more likely to have smoked cannabis, 14 times more likely to have been a victim of sexual abuse, 15 times more likely to have committed violence against another person, 16 times more likely to have used crack, cocaine, or heroin, and the worst one, 20 times more likely to have been incarcerated at some point in your life. And this is why this is a health issue and why this is preventable, because we know who some of these people are. And we can do more proactive work at the preventative and intervention stage to stop this, because adverse childhood experiences rewire the brain. They make people respond to things in different ways, and they actually change the thought processes and how you respond to fight and flight. And here's a series of just research which shows an emerging research body that adverse childhood experiences contribute to the perpetration of sexual abuse. There is a growing body of evidence that this is life course, that this is health related. But this isn't the first time we've heard this. So one of the most important studies you'll ever read in criminology is the Cambridge study by David Farrington. And they basically demonstrate that what happens in childhood leads to criminogenic and antisocial behavior in later adulthood. We know from developmental studies, things like Moffitt, that there's 2 types of offenders. There's adolescent limited, and they're the bulk, but most of them stop offending at some point. And then there's life course persistent, who are a small group of offenders, but it costs a fortune to the system because they're in and out of prison constantly. They're constantly under supervision, and they're constantly coming up against the police. But if we know that these individuals are exposed to some of these problems, then we can do something about it in the preventative end. The other thing that's happening at the minute is around trauma-informed care. We know that men and women respond to trauma differently. Women internalize traumatic events. They turn to self-harm. They have increased mental health problems. They have drug and alcohol addiction. Men externalize. Men become violent. Men become antisocial. And trauma-informed care, and I'll just read this out, is in the simplest terms, the concept of trauma-informed care is straightforward. If professionals were to pause and consider the role of trauma and lingering traumatic stress plays in the lives of a specific client population served by an individual, professional, organization, or an entire system, how would they behave differently? What steps would they take to avoid or at least minimize adding new stress or inadvertently reminding the clients of past traumas? How can they better help their traumatized clients heal? In effect, by looking at how the entire system is organized and services are delivered through a trauma lens, what should be done differently? If we're saying that perpetrators have adverse childhood experiences, if we're saying that they have problematic and trauma-filled experiences, how can we think about that? Because in reality, we have to deal with their trauma before we can even get on to the trauma that they've caused other people. And what you're seeing now is, so this is again some references and some links to research, but you're seeing trauma-informed schools. How do you build a school for problematic children who are displaying harmful behaviors, but they're doing that because they're traumatized? And how do you work with them to reduce the impact of that trauma upon other people? And we're also seeing it in healthcare. So implementing trauma-informed care for youth inpatients in nursing. So we need to think about the causes of sexual abuse and why people ended up abusing in the way that they did. Which leads to this. For many years, we asked the wrong question. We asked the question of, how do we get you to stop doing what you're doing? We never thought to ask, why did this group stop and has this group not stopped? And that's what Shad Maruna asked us. So Desistance is trying to find out why people stop offending, because the majority of offenders stop offending. But we have focused for so long on that small group who don't stop offending and trying to get them to stop that we never thought to ask the other group, the larger group, why they stopped. And what we see with sexual offending, so Carl Hansen has done a massive meta-analysis, which is what this is, and he's looked at offending across the lifespan, and his research has basically indicated that the majority of sexual offenders stop offending. And that risk is dynamic. So within 20 years, you can drop from being very high risk to low risk. If you have community support, if you hold yourself to account and others hold you to account, you can reduce the risk that you have of reoffending. And that's what this speaks to. We talk a lot about social capital, that you need a positive social relationship around you and positive social networks help you stop offending. But actually, we need to think about recovery capital. So this comes from the drugs literature, and this is really about heroin withdrawal and alcohol withdrawal. And it says that social capital matters, but then there's physical capital. So do you own a car? Do you own a house? Because physical capital enables you to do things. So think about some of the guys that you've worked with. You get them a job at a warehouse. You finally get them a job. They have to be there for 9 o'clock, but the bus doesn't go past the warehouse till 11 o'clock. So how are they going to get there? They don't own a car. They don't have any money. So actually they need to turn the job down because they don't have the physical capital to enable them to re-engage in a proactive way. Human capital is about your skills base. We know this population spans learning difficulties, borderline learning difficulties. You go to prisons and institutions and they're filled with people that range from bin men to judges. We know there's a wide IQ spread and a wide skills spread, but what skills have you got? What qualifications have you got that enable you to integrate in a proactive way? And then the last one is cultural. So what are the cultural values of the society that you live in? Do you believe in integration? Do you believe that people can have a second chance, that people can come back to communities? And it's always interesting when you talk about probation and the prison service, because the role of them is to punish and rehabilitate and integrate. But a lot of people don't think that that's true. So this is about practical social networks, and this is about cultural ideals. And what we need is, when we think about the integration of people back into the community, and I do believe in integration, I don't believe in reintegration. Reintegration doesn't exist. Reintegration is the notion that you bring someone back to a point that they were before. You don't want to bring them back to how they were when they were offending or before they were offending. You want to integrate them in a new pro-social, proactive way. And actually, for many of these guys, their lack of integration in the first place was probably a contributing factor to why they offended in the way that they did. So that's the same thing, but it talks a little bit about COSA. The other thing that we need to do is we need to trust our professionals more. How many times have you heard that, well, there's not a randomized control trial, there's no evidence base? People are working at the coalface. They work with these guys every single day. They hear the stories, they know how to interpret the stories, but also they hear the preventative messages that if there had been someone I could have talked to, I might have stopped. I didn't realize that I had a problem. My drink and alcohol problems really fueled my sexual abuse, but I didn't know how to stop. There was no support out there for me. And we spend a lot of time understanding sexual abuse, doing rehabilitation and treatment and management. And, it's a bit like action research. We all feed into this and it changes. But we need to take this knowledge and put it into prevention. We need to be thinking about how professionals can help us understand what prevention works and where we can intervene and where we can't intervene. And the people who know that best of all are you, because you're the people working at the coalface in this regard. So one of the things that we've talked a little bit about is reframing this and what this means for at-risk populations. But this is a challenge. If you're going to ask people to self-identify themselves as being potentially pedophilic, of being potentially at risk of committing a sexual abuse or sexual assault, you're going to need infrastructure there. Because the worst thing that you can say to someone is, we want you to come forward and disclose, and they do it. And you go, yeah, but we've got no support for you, and there's nowhere that we can send you, because that will cause havoc. That will increase risk and make it more likely that people may well offend. And I don't know if it's the same in every country, but in the UK, drugs is a really good example of this. The best way to get on a drug treatment program in the UK is to be caught taking hard drugs. To be caught with heroin, that's the best way, because then they have to do something about it. You shouldn't have to commit sexual abuse to get help to stop you from committing sexual abuse. But you need an infrastructure there. And that's being identified at the minute. We don't know what that looks like. So in the UK, you've got the Safer Living Foundation, and they're building a walk-in centre. Is that the best approach for people to walk in somewhere and meet a therapist? Stop so we're doing it over the phone, where you don't meet people on the first occasion. Is that maybe the best way? We don't have the evidence base. We don't know. And that's why we need to look to professionals to guide us with their knowledge of what works with the service users that they engage with. The other thing is public and media engagement. And I will reinforce this. I know I said it earlier, but professionals do have a role to play in this. So I remember when I did my PhD many, many years ago, it was on public and professional understandings of pedophilia. And I talked to a lot of professionals who said the public don't understand this. They don't get it. They're uneducated about it. And they believe in myths and stereotypes. And then I would say to them, and what have you done about that? Oh, nothing. It's not my job. I disagree. It is our job. If we're working in this area, it's our job. And, the dinner party example is a good example. So at first I used to terrify people because I would just come out with it and they would leave and I could clear a room in like 15 seconds. But now you extend the conversation. So it's, what do you do? I'm an academic. What do you do? I'm a criminologist. And then by the time that there's 7 questions in, they can't leave because it looks slightly awkward. They've invested in the conversation. But I run a blog with David Prescott where we talk about a lot of these issues and we talk about the research and the practice. But it's also important to do stuff in the media. So this was a piece that myself and Stuart Alderdice did at the NOTA conference. We talked to the Scottish Herald and they wrote a piece based on the work that is being done. And you can't really read this here, but it says, potential child abusers deserve our help to stop. We are seeing positive news stories, but we need to get out in front of this. We can't just say that we're not going to talk about it or we're only going to respond to negative cases. We have to talk about some of the good work that we do. So an example of this is from Northern Ireland. So Marcella Leonard used to be the head of PANI, which is the Northern Irish version of MAPA. And they were getting criticised all the time in the local news. So her solution was she went to the local news and said, can we do a documentary series? And they went, okay. And she said, but there's a deal. You can have full access to probation and you can have full access to do whatever you want. However, one of the documentaries has to show the positive work that we do in managing offenders on a daily basis. That when things go wrong, and they can go catastrophically wrong, that isn't what happens the vast majority of the time. The vast majority of people are managed proactively within the system, and social workers, probation officers, police officers manage that risk. So it's about pushing back and showing the good news stories and not being afraid to say, actually, we are proud of the work that we do and the public protection that we do. The other big one is the evidence base. So the first one talks about the scientific method. Here are the facts. What conclusions can we draw from them? The second one is the political method. Here's the conclusion. What evidence can we find to support it? And we've all been in that situation before. And researchers and academics will want to pursue what they want to pursue. But if you're changing policy and practice, if you're working with a minister or you're working with senior people in government, the minister's not going to read everything that you have written. They're not going to engage with something. They will give a portfolio to someone and say, come back with 2 pages, break it down for me, and then we'll make a decision upon it. We have to get better at knowing the language of changing policy and practice. And we're not often very good at that. And changing the language is important because if we want people to buy in to maybe sexual abuse is a public health issue, sexual abuse is a health issue, it's a life course issue, rather than just a criminal justice issue, we have to be able to convince politicians, especially when you consider that your Minister for Health or your Minister for Education may not have a background in that area. They've been given a portfolio by someone. And so we have to be able to demonstrate to them why this is important. So we have to get out of our comfort zone. We have to do 1 pages. We have to talk to them in language that they'll understand, because ultimately it's about convincing them to change practice. So what I just want to finish on is that this is an ongoing cycle. You know, really, we're talking about media engagement, public engagement, professional engagement, and research. We need an evidence base, but we need an evidence base that's realistic. So a randomized control trial for circles isn't appropriate. It's maybe appropriate in some parts of the world where circles has existed for longer. But if you've just introduced circles 12 months ago and you don't have 47 people that have been through it and you don't have a waiting list, then it's not appropriate. Qualitative research and case studies really help with this. It's about identifying the best evidence base and working with that to be able to show progression, but also to be able to show what policymakers and the press and the public want to say and want to hear. And sometimes this means reframing what you want to do in a way that you may not initially be comfortable with, but enables you to get to the point that you want to get to. So I would just finish by saying we have to move away from sexual abuse being labeled purely as a criminal justice issue. It's a health issue. It's a public health issue. It's a developmental and a life course issue. Perpetrators who perpetrate have experienced quite often adverse conditions themselves, and we have to think about trauma. But what this all means is that we can prevent it. We can do more work at the front end, and it's actually how we link up prevention and services like education, social work, the police, safeguarding authorities to enable abuse stops before it starts. So I'm going to be quiet now, and I'm very happy to answer any questions that you have. But I'm also very happy if you don't want to ask questions publicly. If you want to come up, I'm very happy to answer them at the front. And what I will say is I'll just put my email address back up, and feel free to drop me an email about anything. And if you want access to stuff, that's great. Thank you. So are there any questions from the floor?
How do you think to start with?
Just hold on. There you go. Thank you.
Are there any ideas to start with it?
So I think the way that we start with it is there's about 3 or 4 things that I think. The first one is this can't be about the extreme offenders. This can't be about changing public opinions of entrenched, dangerous, pedophilic individuals or child sexual abusers or serial killers. We need to put it in a frame that people will be happy with. So I often think that actually the way to start with a lot of these things is to think about youth. And we know that youth commit the vast majority of harmful sexual behavior, but we also know they don't go on to reoffend in the same way that a lot of life course persistent adult offenders do. So that's the first thing. The second thing about youth is we're more willing to accept adverse experiences affect youth. Yeah, like these are problematic youth, but look at the family environment that he grew up in. Look at the problems that he has with drugs and alcohol, influenced by the fact that maybe his father was an alcoholic or his mother was a drug addict. So I think we're starting to see, that's why I would start with youth. The second thing that I would say is it's about starting to think about the consequences. So we often frame things in terms of the consequences for victims, but a really good example of this was from Northern Ireland. So for those of you who aren't aware, Northern Ireland has its own brand of community justice. They like to take the law into their own hands. And after Good Friday, you saw a lot of paramilitaries go into community leadership roles. And there was a case where paramilitaries and ex-paramilitaries were spray painting on walls. So Jim is a sex offender, Jim is a pedophile. And they were asked, why are you doing this? And the answer was, we wanted the community to know. We wanted the community to be aware. Like, okay, but the victim walks past that every day. The offender's family walk past that every day. Do you think that his mother and his sister and maybe his wife was aware of his offending and that they need to be reminded of it? So it's thinking about those collateral consequences beyond the perpetrator themselves, about the family members and about the victims. And then I think the last thing is one of the worst things the criminal justice argument does is it creates an artificial divide between people who work with victims and people who work with perpetrators. We're doing the same work. We're dealing with the same issues. But actually, thinking about the fact that we have more in common with each other and we want the same things. Victims' charities want offenders to be held to account. They want offenders to stop offending. They want to prevent offending. They want to do good proactive work in schools, the same as the police and probation and people who advocate treatment. So we need to break down this artificial divide that exists. So I think it's about choosing who you have the conversation about, the way in which you have the conversation, and bringing both victims and other organizations together to be on the same page. Okay, I think we're all in need of a coffee now. So I just want to say thank you. I'll hang around for a bit if you've got questions and you want to come up, but thanks. Bye.
Thank you very much.
For presentation, actually, this was more like described everything more better than yesterday. I have a question actually regarding a teacher, like quite many sexual offenders had experienced in their childhood something bad, and this broke this to offense. And it is especially, I think, with with juveniles who are sex offenders, who became sex offenders. And I come from a town where only kids in prison here in Latvia. We have in practice like those who are sex offenders really have their own like injuries, mental injuries from some bad events. And what do you think? How to balance that in custody if they get to prison, and in the other hand if they get in our system in probation? So it is still, there must be some punishment, and sometimes it's quite harsh punishment. But on the other hand, we need to solve a problem, like a core problem.
Yeah, it's tough. So in Latvia, when children get to 18, do they go automatically into the adult system?
Not exactly, but
Actually, I think they go
mostly.
We are now starting the initiative that we will have juvenile justice, but it meet very harsh arguments. So I think not in this decade.
Yeah.
So we try to implement some juvenile justice system, but not in this decade. So it goes through the criminal justice.
So what happens in the UK is that once you reach 18, your offence gets sealed and you get treated as a juvenile, then unless your offence is significant enough, so like murder or something like that, the vast majority of them get released in and around their 18th birthday, then their records get sealed and no one has access to them. And it's this idea that you committed this offence as a juvenile, and actually we know, we know that the juveniles are a bit scared. We know they make bad decisions across the board, and they're not held to account for their offences. So you see advantages, but what you explaining, there was a really good report done in the US by Human Rights Watch called Raised on the Registry, and in 20 American states, they put children on the registry and they publicly disclosed them. And it covers things from sexual assault right down to urinating in public or flashing. And what they find is that these children had done things, but when they became adults, they couldn't go to school. children of their own, they were excluded from seeing their own children because they were a registered sex offender. So you had a lot of these children committing suicide, and a lot of these children posing real problems. They couldn't live in the family, they had siblings. So it caused real problems.
So it's terrible consequences in 3 years.
And this is why, like, the register is important. It's important for police, it's important for probation. But that's what it should be for. It shouldn't be completely available because I struggle to say what the benefit of knowing it is. And people ask me, they say, I've got 8-year-old son. They say, would you want to know? I'll be like, actually, no. How would it improve my life to know that? But I think one of the things, going back to your initial question about juveniles, is that actually what you see quite often is when juveniles are put in programs and interventions that offer them support that are trauma informed, that get them to recognize what has happened to them and what they've done to other people, that they realize the consequences of their offending quite quickly. And it's about that support network.
And I think you touched the key if they get put in programs.
Yes.
If some work can be done regarding the core problems. But we have example back in my town in Zes, where I'm coming from. We had a situation like a boy, 40-year-old boy, is criminal liability. He has criminal liability now,
Yeah.
14 years age here in Latvia. And he was accused for misuse of his sister in family, abused, yeah. And finally, when the investigation went away, there was a pre-sentence report for probation, and from this point we get involved in this process. And during the interviewing process of that boy, we found out like he has been used, offended by his stepfather, and so long story, let's say. But what went some kind of positive way during the court. Our judge had used the possibility to not punish him so harsh as criminal liability would ask to do, but she used alternative. We have alternative laws.
Measures.
Yeah, and now he is in on an institution, yeah, special school. But what is going wrong? I think in that special school, there is no any program for
No such specific work
Bingo.
with
Bingo.
these risks of
yeah.
behavior.
And it's against
That's
cycle.
sort of juvenile justice system in Latvia, but when they get outside the prison, they do not get this intervention and this intervention. So,
And I think that's important. One of the things that, unless you're very psychopathic individuals, sexual abuse doesn't come nowhere. It comes from somewhere, and you see it. Yeah,
Probably sometimes.
and you see it in schools. Like, so for instance, at my son's primary school, he came home and like he said, "Oh, there were a couple of boys talking about sex." Okay. And what it turned out was that one of the boys that said you're out of his class is that bedroom where your father has sex with you. And you're like, how would a child know to say that? That's an alarm bell going off. Yeah.
it's serious a lot.
Yeah. But I think that a lot of juveniles that it's about a youth system, but it's also about actually we know things direct you to either offender. We know it's a stable environment. We know it's a stable relationship. We know it's a positive interaction with other people. So the reality is it's about building that networks, and that's why you see things like community engagement programs work really well with youth, and we should see that in the States and in Australia. But I think the conversation about youth is the place to start. It's actually the place to start to think about harmful behaviour and harmful sexual behaviour is just an extension of other harmful behaviour. So you will say that they might be aggressive as well. There might be domestic violence in their relationships, things like that. There might be, it might be drug use. So, like a really good example was when I was at school, it wasn't drug use; it was glue. People used to sniff glue, and that had a real impact. But no one quit. It wasn't that they were going to get cannabis or getting heroin, which was illegal. Glue's not illegal. So they find other ways to get around this. But yeah, but the sound of things from what you were saying yesterday, it sounds like some of the healthcare stuff that you're doing, right? It's hopefully heading in the right direction.
Actually, I want to say that it was again an impressive presentation. I saw the presentation yesterday, and I was seeing also today. But do you know the joke about criminologists?
No.
They are digging the hole where they will fall. And if I go to our Ministry of Health and says something that these abuse things are a matter of health issue, I think they will go their mind. But I agree with you totally.
But so what we are seeing is we have had acknowledgement from health and social care that sexual abuse is a health issue, but they won't do it publicly. And they said they won't do it publicly because they'll have to. If they acknowledge that it's a health issue, then they will have to fund it.
Yes. But there are some consequences.
Yeah.
But actually, thank you very much for such a presentation.
No,
Makes to see us a little bit different.
And you have my email address anytime. Because I have asked the months a couple of times how things are going. But if you ever want anything, just give me an email. You know where I am. My pleasure. Thank you.
Забить место.
Oh, exactly. You would like to be exactly what you're thinking. Yeah, you talked to him. Oh, okay. So I'll leave that to you to decide to go. I would very much like it. Yeah, okay. He said you're we would understand what you're saying now, so it's a good. If you make it more clear to say, okay, no social justice. Yeah, now there's a special group of supporting delegates containing months and the pilots and the Altiana. Like this 10 or 12.
No, we start with Emma's and Anvar are doing their keynote, and then we go from that into that.
Antas, is there a presentation or not? Yeah? Is there a presentation? Yeah? I think iemand, is it on this one? Is it this one?
No,
Where is it?
if it's not, maybe. I hope that I take this.
Oof. Which one? Riga? This one? Date modified. Always helps.
Yes, it's gonna be. No, it's gonna be the 6th.
Is it? Yeah?
Maybe yes. You can try to open and
Yeah, but then everybody will see it. Okay, open. But it's the last one. Is this?
I hope. Can you show me the
Which one? You have.
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, then I file, save as.
Is nog iets aangepast?
Ja, dat stond er niet op. Dat zegt hij van niet.
Klaus is
vienkārši viņš tur uz galvas jau priekšā, ja?
Jā.
Un nenes
Deze.
Es vienkārši turpināt.
Riga, wat is dit dan? Snap? Oh, dat
Klaus
zijn wij.
is wel.
Ik weet niet wat het is.
Tātad no šejienes es pārņemu, ja?
Nee, dat is hem wel. Dit is hem.
Ja, maar die andere was
No
toch?
šitās
Nee,
vietas.
maakt niet uit.
Ja?
Nee, ze hebben weer wat veranderd. Dus ik ga
Tu beidz ar šito slaidu, ja tu vēl.
laat deze staan.
Jā, es seks everything beidz.
Un tad pēdējās daļas visas ir manas.
Daar, dat dingetje, dat kopje, zeg maar, daar. Nou,
Un tu beidz tagad.
naar boven, naar boven, naar boven. Die ja.
Es beidzu. Pirmo daļu es beidzu, kur es beidzu stāstīt
Ja.
Ik weet niet of we die bordjes daarvoor hebben.
par to
Ja, dat
gadījumu.
heeft geen zin, denk ik.
Ja? Mhm. Nu, es esmu satraucies, bet tas ir.
Ja, aizmirsīs vienkārši stāstu, kā jūties.
You take this one first. You would use that one, okay? Yeah? Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. I like to continue.
Hi, my name is Imants Jurevičius. I will introduce myself. And I have a presentation prepared about experience in Latvia together with my colleague Anvars Zavadskis. But before I do that, I will say a couple words on Latvian to my colleagues. Kolēģi, es zinu, ka programmā ir ierakstīts par pieņemšanu un vakariņām, kas ir paredzēts pēc šīs dienas oficiālas daļas beigām. Bet lieta tāda, ka tās aktivitātes ir paredzētas tiem, kas reāli dzīvo šajā viesnīcā, un par kuriem tiks samaksāta pilnā dalības maksa. Viljams man lūdza pateikt, ka, protams, neviens prom netiks dzīts, kas aizkavēsies mazliet ilgāk un gribēs pievienoties uz pieņemšanas sākumu, bet vienkārši paturiet to prātā.
Okay, Imants.
Household announcements are done.
Yeah.
And today we will tell you about our experience in Latvia, how we developed our system from scratch. 10 years ago, we didn't have anything here in Latvia, and now we are very proud about what we have here in our country. And honestly, I believe we have some very good learnings and experience, which could be of use for colleagues from other countries. And from sex offender survey data, as you saw, half of the Europe doesn't have anything for work with sexual offenders. And the reason of the whole conference here, it's not about just talking what we have or we don't have, and we don't speak so much, maybe at least I hope that in this kind of conference CEP usually organizes, we could speak more about practice, how we can build our systems, develop our systems, and that when you will come back to your countries, you will send an email message to your bosses and will say that we need this. And that's up to them to decide, of course, but that's up to you to inform them what you heard here in Latvia and whether you actually would like to have something similar in your country, whether that's Latvian or Netherlands or somebody else's experience. But I think this is very important, that we try to speak about practice as well. And sometimes there are bad issues linked with practices, like political pressure, some other issues. I will not go in details. And we have structured our presentation in a way that we will also substitute each other with Anvars. And I would like to give floor to Anvars. He will start our presentation and will explain what was the situation in Latvia 10 years ago.
Thank you, Imants. It's a big pleasure for me to be here and speak with you about our experience. And why I think I would a little bit tell about myself. I started work in probation in 2004. And I think after 2 years, I had a chance to participate in a conference. And this was first conference where I heard about work with sex offenders. And it's very interesting. It was CEP conference in 2006 in North Ireland, in Amma. And now I am back, and not only as participant, but now I have the chance to present or what was done here in Latvia. And I will, to describe the situation where we was, I will use my first academic paper on the topic of sex offense. And the name of this paper is Sex Offender in the Community, Case Analysis. I took one case, and the case was about an offender who sexually abused his 2 daughters. He was sentenced with prison sentence, and he was in prison 6 years. And after 6 years, he was conditionally released from detention. And I chose this case because this offender was motivated, at least in some level, was motivated to cooperate with us. And I was interested to understand if an offender wants to cooperate with us, how we can assist him in his desistance process, how far we can assist the offender not to reoffend. And I have some interviews with probation officers, with officers in a headquarters, also with some other experts outside probation. And I would like you to give some quotes from some probation officers or some other ways how they see the situation in 2009. And yes, we can say that in the beginning we have nothing. It means probation service was quite new. This year we all celebrate 50 years anniversary of probation service, and probation supervision we starts in 2006, and yes, in 2009 you can see what how good we are in work with sex offenders. And you can see that probation officers how to work with sex offenders, but they didn't receive any training how to work with offenders. And you can read that I was in a probation officer ward. I was a complete newcomer when I got the client file. I had no knowledge, no stability. I made a translation of handbook used for work with sex offenders in Canada, and in a sense, educated myself. I believe that self-education is a good thing, but I think it's not the core training for probation officer who need work with sex offenders. We had risk assessment tool for general reoffense assessment, but we hadn't no any specific tool. And probation officers saw that really these tools don't help a lot. And you can see I can't understand. It's the next slide. I will come back. Does the instrument help us? Understood. On the whole, it doesn't. We will need a more deep, specific instrument on the problems of these people, because the present one doesn't show us the most important things. He abused his daughters for a long time. It is like a system for him. He did it more and more often. Abuse one daughter, then another. It's alarmed me. This systematic sexual abuse, in fact, reflects his way of thinking. It is about thinking, then it's related to his risk level. But it's this way of thinking how to assess with the tool what's not designed for this group of clients. Also, other thing is that probation officers wasn't ready to speak with clients about his sexual interests, about how he manage his desires, and speak about sex in general. And yes, sexual relationship and sex offense is tabooed. And there is a quotation from head of local probation unit. I can't understand how can one manage a case if you don't speak to the offender, if you don't find out what's really happened. I have noticed that some colleagues are simply afraid of talking about the offense. Some consider it to be too intimate to interfere in it. After all, we dealing with an offense. It's like a taboo. It's like driving a car with a set handbrake. And I think it's very good metaphor about the situation. And I think we all know that work with sex offenders means going into many details of their lives and problems. And we can see also it from this case. I really like it, the fact that I managed to make him pay attention to his thinking errors. He had to consider and reassess the situation. We tried to model situation he would how to avoid, so that he stayed away from these irritants. He even shows some kind of empathy. He sometimes talked about how his daughters feel now. He wanted to some kind of forgiveness. And I think we can see this very important topics that need to be discussed. But yes, in this situation, this was maybe some intuition of probation officer, or maybe sometimes the self-education is quite good. But yes, it's quite clear that it's not enough to be effective. And I think one very important issue is support for work with sex offender, is support to specialists who work with offender. And also, we know that we need to support from outside. We need other institutions, other colleagues who also work with offender, and it was recognized. And not always it was very successful to get them in a work with our client. And here you can see what probation officer said. We searched for a psychotherapist, arranged a talk with 3 of them. I introduced myself and told them I am from the probation service and would like to ask you for your help. Then I introduced the situation involving sexual violence. Everything was over. All 3 refused to get involved, telling that they have enough clients already. The initial interest disappeared. And the good news for us that we find one therapist who was interested in this situation. And probation officer then says that for him it was very important that he is not alone, because sometimes in 2009 it seems that work with sex offenders is very lonely process, very lonely way of how you do your work. But in this, I think it's good that we find some support from outside. And probation officer said, resources involved made me more confident. Even if I didn't pay enough attention to some aspect of the problem, I could hope that someone else noticed it. It gives a sense of security. The fact that someone else sees the client and know about him, it's help. And you can, I think this small quotations show this feeling what's happened in 2009. And it was very clear that we need to do something, and we need to develop specific system for work with sexual offenders. And for this reason, there was initiated project. Project was development of supervision and treatment system for sex offenders in Latvia. And I think the man who know, I think no one other knows so much about this project and about this initiatives as Imants, because he was the head of the project. And I think I will give the floor to Imants to tell us what was done.
Okay, thank you, Anders. Anders described the problem or situation in 2009. And at the same time, Norwegians came. They had so much money they were not able to spend themselves, so they gave us. And we thought that we can, align both problem with money from this Norway grants funds. And why not? And and actually, I think that was the most important thing why we have the system here in Latvia, because at that point we didn't have any political support to provide funding. That was a huge economical crisis in the whole Europe, and especially deep in Latvia. Staff reductions were from 500 and more staff we reduced to 400 in 1 year or half a year even. Our salaries were cut by 40%, and it was drastic. And that was all around the government. It was no way that government will fund something like that without community understanding the sexual violence issue, without no. We even ourselves did not understood it. We just knew that colleagues at training, probation officers, we train on community supervision and assessment of offenders, and how intensely you should work with such or such offender. They just told us that, you are telling all this good stuff, how we should work, but I'm having sexual offender on my caseload. And according to what you are saying to me, I should work with him as a low-risk offender. But I think he is serious one, he abused some people. Yes, he have employment. He's very well integrated into our community. He is well-respected member of our society. He is low risk according to our risk and assessment tools. And those signals came in constantly, and this contributed a lot towards what Ann was told about this problem at the moment we had. And of course, we also had very high-profile cases when some children were abducted and murdered, and a lot of media attention was towards that. And we were very lucky that those were not probation clients who did that. Otherwise, it also could be some very bad influence on our perspectives of development in Latvia, the probation service as such. So Norwegians came, they had a lot of money, we had a problem, and we wrote a project and went on a study visit to Norway and United Kingdom. And the project started and we also spoke with our, it's important to understand that in Latvia, probation in the first 5 years and also sometime before is strongly influenced by Canadians, not UK or Dutch or somebody from Europe, but from Canada, from British Columbia mainly. And we had a very good cooperation with provincial correctional branch of BC Corrections, and their director came to Latvia for several times and talked us about structure of the probation service, have to develop competences you are looking for in recruitment of your staff, and what is the role of the managers, and we had this basis to build upon, and our common risk and assessment tool we also took from Canada, from his organization, adapted into Latvia, translated, and we also had some treatment programs, respectful relationships, substance abuse management, some programming experience as well to facilitate them. We had, thanks to Canadians. And in 2009, when we started the project, it was very difficult to understand, from where to start. We know that we need risk and assessment tools, we need some programs for sex offenders. It's more or less clear, because that's standard. And we heard about something in other countries. We saw something in Norway, something in United Kingdom. And at the same time, we are also very lucky for support we received from Canada. The first training to specialize our probation officers on work with sexual offenders were provided thanks to very good relationships by Canadians. This British Columbia Corrections Branch, their expert came to Latvia. Maybe some of you know him. It's Christopher Thompson, and today we also had this great presentation from Mechthild about COSA. I must say that that's where COSA also came to Latvia, from Chris Thompson. We just finished a training session with him. We were on the elevator going down to the city, and he said, Imans, I think you need COSA. I think, okay, if you say so, let's do COSA. I didn't have any understanding what it is. Just something good, like we also need, so that our system is complete, like a luxury car. And it took some half year for us to understand what is COSA. And we did that in a parallel of introducing MAPA in Latvia. And I would like that my colleague Jānis Zārdiņš stands up now. He's person who was a coordinator for both introduction and researching MAPA and COSA in 2010 in Latvia, and also leader of the pilot projects of MAPA here in Latvia. So if you have some more detailed questions, what people told to him from other agencies about what we are doing, about what we are planning to do, that have crazy VR, and that those Western Europeans are so stupid that they don't understand that sex offenders are not to be supported. They are dangerous, and we understand that, but they in Western Europe, they are just, I guess, too wealthy to understand that. And that's reality. During first 2-3 years, you constantly face these opinions from everybody, from judges, from prosecutors, from social workers, and it's very hard to find somebody who actually would like to dig into it. And I think very correctly, Anmars also told about psychotherapists. It's very big problem was at the beginning. And luckily also during this project, we found one very committed psychiatrist, psychotherapist, with whom I remember I sat down before one of the trainings. We like contracted him, and he asked me, "Imants, I don't know whether I can speak about this issue with your probation officers, and I don't know much about it. I know something about romantic love and something like this, and some basic psychiatric theories, but sexual offending, that's very interesting, of course. I have maybe somebody also between his clients at that moment he had, but we went to the lobby of the hotel, sat there for a couple hours, and went through the slides we got from United Kingdom, some trainings from Christopher Thompson. And that was also very good for him, I think. And later on, he became our best advocate, I would say, of the probation service. He's a very close ally of us, and he actually, at the moment, is specializing. I think he's specializing in work with sexual offenders, and when somebody is asking from somebody from mental health sector to comment on situation in Latvia and about what to be developed now, they usually come to him because journalists also know that he knows about stuff. And so our project was multifaceted. A lot of aspects in 2009, 2010, I will tell later, but I would like also to mention that after that we had the Circles project together with Audrey, Mechtil, Bas Vogelwang, and others from UK also. And we concluded also this multi-agency cooperation agreement between police, prison, and probation. And today, we are like in a stage when we are maintaining existing system and just upgrading it a little bit, I would say so. And I must also say that when I was tasked to do this, to lead this project, to understand what we need in Latvia and have to do that, actually, to lead all the public procurements as well, to find experts abroad when you don't know anybody outside Latvia. It was, I think, I have educational background as political scientist. And when I finished my studies in university, I was writing my master thesis about development of the state probation service in Latvia as a policy transfer example. So I had theoretical background around this policy transfer. Have to do this, have not to make a mess actually through policy transfer in your country. Because if you take something from other country and simply implement in your country, most probably it will not work. You need some infrastructure in place. You need some correct methodology. Have you understand what's in that good idea, what they use or method they use in UK is applicable into your community. And here are some preconditions of policy transfer success. I tried to take into account. There are many other, I think, methodologies or preconditions, some theoretical ideas, have to do this in the best way, whether this is lesson driving or policy transfer, it doesn't matter. It's just important to understand that you need to have at least something, what will guide you through this process if you don't have any idea how to do this. And it's important that it's not copy-paste, as I told, that it's done voluntary by us ourselves. We actually want that. I remember one discussion with my colleagues from other countries who said, Ministry of Justice told that we need to introduce, but we still don't know why we need it. So I'm very lucky that we were not in such situation that some in some other countries, people are in developing their probation services. You don't have enough time. It takes much more time than you can imagine. You need support from courts, prosecutor, Ministry of Justice, police, Ministry of Interior Affairs. You need to involve yourselves into some kind of cooperation arrangements, some kind of, you need to invite them to the conferences you're organizing, seminars, and to find your ways towards their, to open their minds. Because at the beginning, they see you as a competitor, that probation service established, why do we need probation service? You already do a good job. Do you think we don't do good jobs, therefore you establish probation service? We are good professionals. And this is important aspect when you develop probation services. You need to, sometimes, I remember first 5 years, we actually begged judges to ask for per-sentence reports from probation service, because we just introduced them, and we begged to refer some people for mediation, victim offender mediation, to the probation service. And we had very strange decisions from the courts regarding our applications when person under community supervision we asked to put back in prison. And this is a very interesting experience, of course. And I think we have long away from that situation we had 10, 15 years ago. But yeah, and you of course need to have this problem, as Anders characterized, recognize problems that everybody understands that there is a problem we need to solve somehow. And yes, and you should also go abroad. That's very critical. You should meet people, you should establish relationships with those people, and then you will get really useful information from them. About project in 2009, 2011. First thing we said that we would like to have specialists on sexual offenders in each office of probation in Latvia, at least one. And I will not go into details how difficult it was actually to motivate people to become specialists on sexual offenders. From some offices, managers just told, you will do this, because everybody is doing, we also should do this, you will do this. And that person did not want to do that. And we had many of those people who went to the training and just during the training said that they will not continue it, or after the training, some months said, I will not do this. I don't want it. And this is, yes, we made some mistakes, but it was difficult, but I guess that's something everybody will face. You need to start somehow, and completely on voluntary basis. If you will do that, most probably it will not happen good, because you don't have so much time usually, to speak to people. We need to do something for 3 or 5 years. We have project money here and today. We need to have the specialization next year. Otherwise, Norwegians with their money are gone, and that's how projects are implemented in all across Europe now. Eastern Europe is full with projects. And in Latvia also, we are for 15 years in constant development thanks to the various projects. Manuals. First of all, we needed to find experts on risk and need assessment. And we wanted to find such experts who can train our own trainers afterwards. And we contacted Carl Hansen. It was advice from Canadians. Carl Hansen gave us a list of 4 persons. Himself, he said, I will not go. I can do this, but I will not do this. I'm too busy. There is Andrew Harris. We contacted him. He said, I'm also too busy. Then there was Pamela Yates and Robin Wilson at that time. And we were able to contract Robin Wilson. But it was it was not easy. It took some months of negotiations and making sure that at the beginning it was also a shock how much money they ask, to be honest. Especially if you are looking for somebody from Canada or North America, they ask $1,000 per day and plus somebody 4,000 asks. And when you would like to establish long-term relationships, your training is 20 days or longer. It's a lot of money. Especially if you need to put also together with translation services, you need to procure. They don't speak Latvian. That's, I guess that's not a surprise. And hotel services and whatever linked with all the training activities, logistics, road and it's a lot actually. And but okay, we contracted him. He sent huge amount of materials. That was another shock when we realized that he sent us training manuals for those static, stable, and acute trainings. They were like such a big package. You need to go through the trainings. And it took some while for us to translate it. Interpreters, translators at the time also did not knew this terminology of criminal justice in English. So while they found out how to translate into Latvian language, they developed some new words. And or Laura, here, translator today, interpreter, is a person who actually was from the very beginning together with us in doing this. And we are extremely thankful for her. She was great interpreter at that time, helped us a lot. Yes, but that was also very, very time-consuming process to translate, because when we received back from those interpreters these huge binders, we realized that we can give these binders to our staff. Translators worked like half a year almost to translate them, and they said it was so difficult. They invested so much resources. They will not review it another time. But what to do now? I sat down and read together with Anders by ourselves what they actually submitted to us, and it took another half a year to correct it in a way that it's according to the original translation, so that people are not misguided, have to assess, people have to score specific items, and we had also a discussion about information sources, what they use in North America, and what kind of sources we can access to, so that we can get objective information for assessment, so that it could be like really, we can say that we introduce a static, stable, acute in Latvia, not something similar to it. And that's a lot of work. And after that, you need to train your staff, and then train again, and 5 more times. And because at the beginning, we thought we will train once, and they will just go in field and work and do great assessments. That's not how it works. It doesn't work like that. You need to go to inspect their cases, take out specific examples, explain, contact Robin Wilson or whatever expert you are having there. He's giving back you answers, and you need to understand again how it fits within your legislation, whether you need to adapt or not the methodology you have in Latvian language, and this is complex, thing. At the end, we trained 60 probation officers in the first training, and 3 of them were promoted to the trainers training. One of them was Anwars, and he actually, at the moment, is the only one who finished that training. Trainers training is very, very serious. You need to have scientific level of knowledge. It's not just policy level, it's real scientific level of knowledge. Not only doing assessments, you need to write scientific articles for peer-reviewed journals. You need to understand scientific research methods, how static was built. And this is very, very serious. And you can do this right away after the first training. You need at least 1-2 years of practice before you can proceed further to the trainers training. And yes, we also trained prison officers and probation managers about what we are introducing in Latvia. That was also big discussion at the moment. And we decided, of course, they also should know what their probation officers are doing with the sexual offenders. And prison officers also should know something, because we would like actually to start to work with them while they are in prison, not only when they are out of the prison. Treatment programs for sex offenders. Yes, we thought it will be much simpler as well. We contacted the UK. We had a great group of experts, thanks to the Ministry of Justice and Steve Pitts, who is ambassador of CP at the moment, who personally helped us a lot to get the people together. It was Clark Bain, Lydia Guthrie, Elizabeth Hayes, Dale Middleton, Don Fisher, Anthony Beach, and they prepared the training for our colleagues here in Latvia on this UK program for sexual offenders. It's, again, big binders, manuals for program facilitators. Again, you need to translate it. And in this case, you need to translate it also in Russian language because you have mixed groups and you need to prepare bilingual program. Latvians, Russians together. In Latvia, Russian is the main language people speak in prisons. I think still. And of course, in communities also. In community, we have several cities where it's a dominant language. And yeah, that's again 1-2 years, and we had several work groups who are trying to understand what's wrote in there, what's applicable to us, and what's not. And that was also a big shock in a way, that those 3 programs I mentioned before we took from Canada, their manuals were much smaller, I would say. So we expected something similar to receive, but we received this again binder, and training lasted for 2 months. Out of the office, probation officers were involved in training. We had assessment center. This group of 4-5 international experts with interpreter, Laura, together, were trying to understand whether those people who were promoted to this treatment providers training actually understand where they are going. Do they have motivation? Do they have theoretical knowledge about treatment and all this stuff? According to the standards UK had at that time. And we were successful. In a way that we recruited the necessary amount of colleagues to facilitate the treatment program. They went through all stages of the training, which was followed later on with advanced training. After they have put their knowledge into practice, they formed their groups and some time worked with them. And today, this is one of the core programs in probation service. I would say the quality standard, I would say, even so, it's very high for this program. And we would like that all programs are similar in how good manuals are, how good people are trained to facilitate those programs. And yeah, we are very, very proud about this program at EvidenceBased. And we also did some works in prisons. At that time, we had program from Russia. Also transfer. I heard that in Russia developed this program according to some manuals from Canada. So they took from Canada, we took from Russia, and adapted in Latvia, and tried to unite those both programs with this community program. We were not very successful, but in essence they are very similar. But to develop a system when you start treatment in prison and then continue into community without starting again from the beginning with hot chair and all this stuff. And it took a lot of time, and I'm not sure whether we are completely finished with this, that we can smoothly transfer treatment from prison environment to the community environment. That's, I guess, issue we should still work on with prison service, not only regarding this program, but also other treatment activities and transition to community preparation for release in general of prisoners. Yes, we have 18 group work facilitators. They work in pairs. And by the way, also trainers we have trained, additional training of 1 month or something like that for them. And but it's important to mention also quality assurance system. It was very important part, and I know that in many countries when you speak about such kind of development, you forget about that. At the beginning, we are not very, strongly motivated to take it, but because it was one of the clauses in the contract with Ministry of Justice of England that we should also do everything according to standards in England, that we were obliged to introduce this quality assurance system as well. We took, okay, we don't want to make English people angry. We will do this. We will find resources for that. And that was an additional 1 or something more weeks training in United Kingdom. It mainly means that we are video monitoring. We are recording sessions. We have specially trained people. Usually they are the same trainers of this program who are reviewing taped material and organizing feedback to the facilitators, as it's done also in England. I believe so. It should be so. And development of this introduction of this treatment program for sex offenders actually hugely influenced how we viewed what we understood with programs in general in Latvia, how we transformed the whole system now in Latvia. And it's important also to note that thanks to the sexual offenders, this project, that's my personal belief, and later developments, we were able to increase on a very high level reputation of the probation service as such in our community, and to establish very good working relationship with journalists. Because at last they had somebody to ask for expert opinion, and through years it worked out very well, and it's still very good relationships. I see At the moment, I believe probation service is an expert organization where you can ask for some questions what we in general in Latvia should do about policy issues, and we are very happy that we can speak about positive things rather than some problems we had. And sometimes we also have problems, but thanks to those relationships with juniors, they don't want to mess them up, and they are happy about good relationships with our experts. And so maybe sometimes they are not so harsh about our mistakes. And that helps us a lot, of course, to also increase funding and receive political support and develop further. Yes, this is a little bit about the program itself. It's 7-8 hours, 260 months and 260 hours. First 10 days is very intense. That's full day from morning till evening to overcome denial of the offender. They need to, sometimes they took a vacation from work to participate in the first couple of weeks of the program. It's very difficult logistically, especially if you have low density of population, so that they need to travel from various cities to the program sessions. It's again a logistical issue regarding, as Kieran mentioned, when bus is going from that village to the city center, and you need to know to deliver this program when they are able to come, and you need to adjust as a probation service. I know that sometimes we even draw a car and took the offender and drove him to the other city where the treatment program is facilitated, and we are doing that every week for this 1 year, and that's an issue, logistical matters, and not everybody is suitable for group work, and it's we also filter out, of course, with mental health issues and substance abuse issues and some other reasons why it will not contribute to the group work dynamic in itself. And then we, of course, work with them individually under community supervision framework. On this slide, there's information about prison sex offender treatment program. It's 1.5 years long. And I know that some of my colleagues, also Yatso, were surprised that we have 6 hours a day in this program for inmates. I don't know precisely why it is so, but I think this is somehow linked with logistical matters within prison, that it's much easier for them once per day to organize for the whole day this treatment session instead of several times a week, because you need to accompany inmates. There is internal in prison logistical issues also for our colleagues. It's not always possible to drive to the prison 2 or 3 times a week. And we also have MAPA. We had 4 pilots. Our cooperation partner was UK MAPA, Neil Bruno and Shelly Scott, I should mention definitely. And we developed also with Canadian support, Wilson and McQueenie, recommendations for circles of support and accountability, and also MAPA to introduce them in Latvia. And to introduce MAPA, actually, whatever you are trying to introduce, you need to organize a lot of informative seminars. Just drive across Latvia. We did those many seminars to judges, prosecutors, police officers, social workers, just to tell what we are doing now. We just had a seminar. Somebody from abroad came, and we are introducing now MAPA. And then you need to explain, what is MAPA? Why do we need MAPA? Are we working bad at the moment? No, we are not working bad. And especially if you should speak about MAPA, the biggest problem at the beginning was that, of course, that they don't understand why we need to work with sex offenders. That's one issue. But another issue that they don't want to share information. That information is a wealth of the organization. They were asking, okay, if we will give you some information, what you will give us back? What kind of information so that we can use it? And this is not always, I would say, productive, especially if you are a young service and you don't have information to give back to them. But they are actually thinking, recognizing as useful for their purposes. And it was some time for us to change the attitudes towards cooperation in general between state agencies, between state and municipal social work services. It's still challenging at the moment, I think, in Latvia, and it will take some more years to completely to achieve that level that we can say we are very proud about this multi-agency arrangements in Latvia. We are just in 2015 concluded this agreement between police, prison, probation. It's still 3 years only old, and at the moment we are strongly focused on those 3 agencies, and we of course try to involve many other stakeholders on those meetings. But I believe that will be a big task for us for the next years to do it better, more efficient, and to expand the stakeholder amount who are involved in this. And yes, you I guess also saw how much it costs in general, at least how much we paid for that. For MAPA only, we paid 70,000. And there was also numbers on sex offender treatment program. It costs 400,000 euros, and risk and assessment tools, something like I think 200,000 or 300,000 euros. In total, that's 700,000-800,000 euros to introduce such system as we had in Latvia during those 2 years. It's a lot of money, especially in Latvia. Some of learnings I would like to mention. That's, I think, that's my opinion. When you look for international experts, look for ambitious, well-connected, knowledgeable, supportive. That's very important. You should find somebody like Kiran. He's a model example, actually, of the expert you should look for. And if you will just contract somebody who would like to make some money, who is in his 60s and close to retirement, and he already knows everything, he don't want to learn himself anymore, my experience is that's not the best what you can do. It's better to hire somebody in 30s, 40s, 50s, who is still on a rise, who also want to achieve still yet some higher grounds, and he will be providing you much more of value, service of value. And Robin and all those experts actually with whom we cooperated from UK, and they connected us with everybody else. They brought us to the big conferences. They took time and care of us and to introduce us to everybody, to Karl Hansen and everybody else, and to integrate us into the community of people who can help us to understand better how to do further systems here in Latvia. Personality of international expert is very good, and my advice is do not contract anyone if you don't know him. If you haven't met him, if you are not confident whether he's the right fit for your organization. He will not try to just give you something, just introduce it because it works somewhere else. It's very important that he recognizes that what works somewhere else might not work in your country. Yes, translation takes 10% of your total budget. You can take that for sure. Risk and assessment tools, there are huge variety of them. That's also something we understood very well. And thanks to our very good experts, they advise the right ones to us. And yes, choose very carefully tools you are using and take into account the, I would say, scientific infrastructure of your country, whether you have anybody in universities understanding criminogenic needs, term of criminogenic needs, criminologists. In Latvia, we didn't have any. And in general, we chose less prescriptive approach. Like, in my opinion, in United Kingdom, for example, they have a lot of very prescriptive assessment tools, strongly based on science and in cooperation with universities and researchers, and they are very strongly validated and so on. But probation officers have a little bit less professional discretion in scoring those items. And there's another model that you can also introduce assessment tools like we did in Latvia, where you can score and more using your professional judgment according to the methodology and framework of it, and predictive validity. This OAK score actually is the same as we have in Latvia and they have in United Kingdom. It's just a matter of your infrastructure you have in your country. How strong are your scientists, universities, and how much you must rely on your own staff and training of your own staff. And you should have, of course, very well-trained probation staff if you would like to use professional discretion in a structured manner. Nobody wants change. Probation officers will say that we don't want that, we don't need that, and you need to find change agents between themselves. You need to find somebody who will help you to promote this idea within their offices and within other offices. You should expect that 90% of people will say that I will not do this until somebody else will not do this. And you need to find those 5-10% who want to be pioneers in their office or their organization to start doing this and showing a good example to others that, we are doing this. You also should start doing this. And procurements, people from abroad don't understand our procurements, that's for sure. And we have a special requirement. I remember one procurement, because when you send procurements to Latvia, those various pages should be very strictly touched together, glue or something, that you are not able to change any page, so that the people are not able to notice. And you should put in envelope and write every requisites on envelope on the other side and submit in the correct time and so on. I remember once we received procurement from abroad. I will not say from whom and when, which procurement that was, but it was like, it was put in an envelope. We understood that it is for us. It was not completely as we were asking to do that. Requisites put there. And it was like such a bunch of pages, something like this. Some signatures on it and something like that. And it was packed like a present, around like. Nice present. We took it out. Our lawyer said, Ivans, what we should do now with this? We should discard it. It's not according to regulations and all this stuff. And for us, that meant that we will not be able to spend in time those 50,000 euros in our budget that we had. No, we solved the situation. But that's something you should expect. From Western Europe, people don't understand procurements done in Eastern Europe. And I think this is one of the most important slides, at least for me personally. This was said by Robin Wilson to us, because I expressed at some point the worries whether what you are telling to us actually is good for us, because those tools and programs and whatever you are telling to us, we are so different and unique, and our experience and all this stuff. I remember Robin watched me and talked for a minute, and he asked, tell me, Mans, do you have sex somehow in a different manner than we are having for different reasons? You are involving yourself in a sexual activity. And that's actually very well characterized the depth on which practitioners are working. That they are working on this level. Why you involve yourself in a sexual activity? What are the reasons of that? And what we can do with this? It's not about policy or something like that. And it's very important to understand that if you have some doubts about this, yes, there might be needs to adapt something, but still, sex is sex everywhere. Okay, I will give my floor to Anwar to finish your presentation.
No, I have 5 minutes and I have 6 different issues what I want to discuss with you more. But okay, I will try to skip something. Yes, we have 5 main laws that relate to work with sex offender. We have special law regarding to sex offenses. And if I would like to show some numbers. We have not a lot of sex offenders under probation supervision, and you can see that A category offenders, we have 68 are suspended, receive suspended custody sentence. 86 have additional sanction, what is probation supervision. Only 14 of our clients in the beginning of 2008 was under parole, and total number you can see is 338 sex offenders who are under probation supervision. If we are looking on all A category sex offenders, you can see that in last years its numbers are growing. It's not a reason. Reason isn't that we have more sex offenders. No, it's a reason because probation supervision is new sanction for us, and it means we get more probation clients who are under probation supervision. Some other numbers, yes, you can see we have 2 programs, we have risk assessment tools, we have 75 probation officers who are trained to work with sex offenders. We have 80 probation officers and 8 prison officers who are trained to facilitate sex offender treatment programs. And now is undergoing training prison staff for use static 99 in prisons. I think I will skip this slide. Maybe one thing what I would like to say about maybe why for us, for example, is very important risk assessment tool. It's if in other countries obligation and restrictions are included in a court order, then in Latvian cases, probation officers should decide about obligations and restrictions. For example, if the sex offender probation can decide that sex offenders should stay at home at the night time. And for this, we need very good assessment and understand what kind of obligations will help us to work with our client. Yeah, I think I can skip it. Also, details about program you can read at home if you are interested. And yes, for us, it's training is very important, and you can see that probation officers can start work with sex offender after 64 hours training. Yes, and after the training, she or he need to complete 3 exams, and only then he is ready to work with sex offenders. One other thing, what I think is very important for good, effective way of work with sex offenders, we need to think about our staff, and we need to support our staff, and we need to be ready 24 hours per day, sometimes support, and to be together with your staff. And I think when we are trying to build system for work with sex offenders, this should be, I think, these aspects you need to very carefully take into account, because if you will not care about your staff, then I think after some years you will not have the staff who work with sex offenders. And last slide, I would like to say some words about priorities today. And yes, one thing what is important for us, and I think also for other countries, you need to keep at mind that if you implement something, you need to evaluate, and you need research to understand work it for you or don't work. And now is going study on predictive validity of static 99 and stable 2007, and also we are looking on incremental validity. And I can say good news for us that we found out that it's valid tools for us, it's work in Latvia. And next thing, next our plans is to train prison staff to use static 99 for risk assessment in prisons. And you can see we have a lot of different ideas what we should do regarding to our staff, how to support and how to assist them in their work. And also, I think the STIS or Latvian version of MAPA is good developed, but I think we need to more and more to involve more partners in this work. And I think it should be developed, and we should continue to work in this direction. And also, I see the future in Latvia also in circles, and I think there also we need some additional input and additional resources to support circles in Latvia. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Imants. Thank you, Anvars, for this presentation. There is not really time to ask for questions, but I think I can say on behalf of all of us that we're impressed what you achieved in, let's say, 10 years. I'm always taking Latvia as an example of change, of movement, and I always compare it to the Dutch situation with a long history of probation, nearly 200 years, but also a lot of sentiments. So what you did in 10 years, it took it, let's say, 200 years. Save your questions for another moment, the break or this evening. And I'd like now to hand over the floor to Kieran, who will lead us into the last session of this afternoon, which is a panel session. So I will take another place, and he will, well, lead us in. Kieran, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Wilhelm. And thank you to Imants and Anvars. That was really inspiring that you have managed to do something in the better part of 10 years, which has taken some of us 100 years to get to. And yes, we'll find out if it was cost effective in the long run. So the idea of this is we're going to have a panel session now where we're going to invite up the 4 keynotes, and we're going to talk about some of the issues that have been raised today across the panels, and we're predicting the issues that will be raised tomorrow because, you know, as all good academics, we just make it up as we go along. And it's also feeding in from what Audrey talked about this morning in terms of the survey that was conducted. So I would like to invite up Mathilde. I would like to invite up Imants. I would like to invite up Vinike and Marianne them to the front, please. So this isn't as spontaneous as it may seem. I did send them questions last week, so they will all have answers to all of the questions. But what I've done, which is my way, and to be fair, I think I slightly terrified Imants yesterday when I came up and said I rewrote a large portion of my presentation during the keynote and said, here you go. So today I sent them 10 questions, but to give them the opportunity to really answer, I'm not going to ask them all the 10 questions. And do feel free to say what you want. So really, the first thing leading off from the conversations that we've had today is, do you think you have realistic policies at this moment in time in the countries that you work in to help you manage and integrate people who have committed sexual offences? Or do you think there's still a distance to go in respect to that? There's not an order. Anyone can start.
Okay, just continues. I think yes. In Latvia, we at the moment have realistic policies, and I think during last year we paid a lot of attention towards sustainability of what we have introduced, and And for example, we have very good cooperation with Ministry of Justice at the moment, and people who are in charge of developing various legislation pieces and concept papers. And we have a national plan how to fight sexual violence against children, where we are also integral part in it. And we have good cooperation with Parliament as well, with commissions responsible for criminal justice system, and they actually listen to us. And that's, I think, collective achievement of our organization. I would like also especially note our head of the service, Michaels, and his contribution towards this very constructive cooperation with our stakeholders, other partners. And of course, we have things to do. I guess that will never end, but I think we have, yes.
I think the Netherlands still has a little way to go. We started early, but we're a land of compromise, and we try to make room for all differing opinions, which makes it hard to really achieve definite change. I think that our cannabis laws are a good example. You know, we're the first in the world to tolerate cannabis use and be relaxed about it, but now other countries have actually really legalized cannabis, and we're still in the middle somewhere between legal and illegal. And I think it's a bit of the same with risk assessment. If I was deeply impressed with what the Latvia presented today. We started so long ago, but we got sort of stuck in the middle: structured professional judgment, somewhat risk assessment instruments, but no really clear policies and no real change. And here, like, you started from scratch 10 years ago and you've got it organized perfectly. That's what I would want to achieve, I think, in the coming years.
So now it's my turn. In Denmark, we're not all there yet. We have done some very sensible things, I think, concerning sexual offender treatment. In 1997, there was a cooperation between our health system, our probation and prison system, and the legislation, where some sex offenders, as an alternative to a suspended sentence, could get sexological psychiatric treatment in outpatient units in our hospitals. And this created a lot of interest and academic understanding in sexual offense and the treatment of sexual offenses. Today, we have still not yet COSA, but are interested in COSA. I think in the future we will try to implement COSA in Denmark. And we still have a group of offenders who are deniers in our prisons. And because they're denying, categorical deniers, they don't get this opportunity for treatment in our outpatient wards, which is a problem. So I think we are lacking a deniers program for this group of offenders, and we are lacking COSA.
10 questions still?
Yeah. If there's anything you would like to add to what Winneke said.
Okay. Well, in addition to what Winneke said about the Dutch situation, I think we are doing fairly well therapy-wise, because there's a lot of expertise in sex offender therapy. I think the community could be more involved in knowing about sex offenders and sex offenders' rehabilitation needs. We have COSA. They are doing rather well with the Dutch probation services. But as Winneke said, we start something and then we go through it and then we are stuck in the middle. That's the same with COSA in the Netherlands. There's not much innovative force in the Netherlands once we have started something which is serving our needs, more or less keeping the public happy, keeping the politicians happy, and then that's it. That's the typical Dutch pragmatism, and we need more innovative force, I think. Thanks.
So one of the things that you have sort of touched on there leads into the next question. So for those of you that are aware, sort of the UK went through a bit of a crash course in how we do treatment and the way that we think about treatment over the past 18 months. So from your perspectives, what do you think are the main perspectives on sex offender treatment in your countries? Is treatment thought of as a viable solution? Is it thought of as an afterthought? Would you say that it's more punitive than rehabilitative? What would your perspectives be?
I think we are relatively treatment oriented and not so much punitive. I've sent a data set to American colleagues to work with, and I'd had the prison sentence in months, and I felt obliged to add yes, really, in months, because we have not these extremely long prison sentences, and everyone should have treatment, and we go a bit overboard in that. We also tend to treat people who are really low risk, which is not only not necessary, but can be risky in and of itself. On the other hand, I have heard Wortley was his name, present on this, and he said there had been some research that said that 90% of the people thought that all sex offenders should be treated, and like 10% believed that it would actually work. I think people think sex offenders should be treated, but I don't really think that people think that it works.
I think in Latvia it's, as Kieran also told, we don't like sex offenders. We would like to apply a punitive, some kind of intervention, but we like treatment. And of course, we have our challenges as well with treatment. We don't provide treatment to everybody. We filter out, and in some places we are not able to deliver this treatment because there are no resources, lack of resources, staff who can do this. And but I would say that we are, at least when I speak with my colleagues who are doing treatment, who are facilitating treatment programs, they are very well with very nice insight into what they are doing, and they would like to do their job as much by taking into account individuality of their participants in the group work and as much as it's possible. So
I think the effectiveness of treatment for sexual offenders is a key issue here, because, well, they're not necessarily recidivate very much if you compare them to other groups in our prisons. And so it's difficult to get an significant effect when you do the treatment. In Denmark, we have also anti-hormonal treatment, which is very effective on recidivism, sexual recidivism. And the politicians sometimes tend to prefer anti-hormonal treatment instead of more psychotherapeutic treatment, which I think is a problem. Yes, that's what I wanted.
I forgot to mention that actually in Latvia we don't have many other options, for sex offenders to receive treatment besides what we have in probation and something, but nothing systemic, as I know. And next year, because today we also don't know how efficient our treatment program is in probation, what we took and introduced to Latvia, but next year we are organizing very serious research to assess its efficiency.
I don't feel competent to talk about treatment, really.
So maybe you can take the lead on the next question then. So we've got a wealth of knowledge at the front, from treatment, from policy, from community, from prisons. What do you see as the main challenges around the management and integration of people who commit sexual offences, and what advice would you give for overcoming or starting to navigate some of these?
I think in the Netherlands we are doing rather well on not having a public notification scheme, which is there in other countries. which gives sex offenders the opportunity to reintegrate on a sort of low-key level. But once it is becoming known that there is a sex offender reintegrating in a community, then our press is jumping onto those cases. And I think we really need to invest in good relationships with the press to educate also the press and use the press to educate the public about how this is so counterproductive when sex offenders are trying to reintegrate and then they are like policed by the whole neighborhood or something. Yeah, that doesn't help a lot. Support helps, but those kind of pressure put on sex offenders is not really helping. And I think really we do need to do a lot more to educate the public about sex offenders and about effective ways to reintegrate sex offenders and what are their problems. I mean, we really need to invest in the public more.
About sex offenders, but also educate the public about sexual offending. And in that aspect, I think that, well, something really has changed with the whole Me Too movement. I think that people starting to realize that it is not a problem of a handful of deviant, crazy perverts, but that it's a societal problem, and that sexually transgressive behaviors are very, very common, and that lots of people are at risk to committing a sexual offense, that it doesn't mean that you're lost forever or that you're some kind of creep. For instance, I think that the downloading of child abuse material is a very good example. Lots of people, there's so many people who do that, who are relatively normal people who somehow got caught in the internet. And you want to educate people and tell them, you know, if you go on the internet every night to see what's there that may be sexually arousing to you, you might end up in a corner where you don't want to be. So I think education is key for the larger part of sexual offenses. There's always these exceptions. High-risk guys are, like you said, are sex is sex everywhere, but sex offenders, like high-risk sex offenders, have very much in common in every corner of the world. But also the normal people in the sexual transgressions, I think education could help us a great deal there.
About Latvian experience, I can say that from my personal experience, and I think the huge challenge in such a developing country as Latvia is when you just start to learn that offenders can be efficiently managed in community, but there are also other solutions besides imprisonment or some very punitive interventions. We need to fight a lot with some great ideas sometimes arising from politicians. I don't know from where they get those ideas about public notification schemas, chemical castrations, physical castrations, and what. During those years, we had several times when there was a huge pressure to introduce something like that, and we tried to fight back. And Anwars also was involved deeply in researching, like tomorrow we need to respond to prepare whether we introduce it or this is maybe not so good idea. When you go to the parliament to explain this, you actually need to have facts in front of you. And indeed, you should read all those 20, 30 articles from somewhere to get them, read them, understand them, and write them into this some kind of report or notes for yourself, and so that you can argument why this is not a great idea, to introduce, as it's the United States, this public notification schema, for example, in our communities, which are not very tolerant communities in general. I think that was the most, and not all fights we won. Mm-hmm. And but yeah.
Okay, so we've talked a lot today about sexual offending, and in the main, we've been talking about contact offending. So we have. Well, I was just wondering, do you have any thoughts or any examples of good practice about alternative offenders, whether that is offenders with learning difficulties, offenders with mental health problems, maybe individuals offending online, because we have to remember that contact offending is one element of the range of sexual abuse that there is out there.
I will say that online offending is a new problem for us. We are starting to receive those people. As yesterday we had a conference, chief of police said that we are, from the police side, very well developed the systems. They are catching them now, so they are slowly starting to fill in our prisons, and in probation also there will be more of them in future. We don't understand this enough yet, I think. But with mental health issues, sex offenders, we understand very well. We have many of them. Some are very, very challenging. And we try to attract psychiatrists and psychotherapists in working with them. I think we have paid for some cases from our own money so that they can attend the psychotherapists and psychiatrists from projects. We are paying this, and in some cases, I understand municipalities are giving money so that they can receive this service. But sometimes, it's very difficult to understand where is this border, whether he is mentally ill or not, and it's not clearly said in Latvia, the diagnose very precisely, and that's maybe done in other countries, because mental health system in Latvia, it could be better, I would say so, as a systemic, this system.
Well, I think the cooperation I talked about earlier between the prison and probation system and the health system in Denmark actually works fairly well, especially with this group, mentally disordered sex offenders, mentally retarded sex offenders. And we also have a huge closed prison called the Herstedvester prison, which delivers special treatment for offenders who are considered being dangerous. So I think we are fairly well equipped towards the more difficult sex offenders concerning mental status.
Yeah,
About the online offenders, which I think is a really interesting group, because parts of online offending are merely new ways of offending for the old offenders. But I think specifically the downloaders of child abuse material, the viewers, are for a large part a new group of offenders who make use of an opportunity that didn't used to be there. But a lot of online offending is like guys who used to go out and try to find children will now do that online and have contact with way more children. And there's always 1 in 100 or maybe 1 in a few hundred that they can somehow keep contact with. So that's partly a new way of offending and partly a new group of offenders. And another thing that I think is worrisome is that within the group of child abuse material users, there seems to be a bit of, I don't know the English word for do you have that iatrogene damage? It's like damage by, the police tries to find them, and that's why they make these communities that you can only get in if you actually deliver some new material. And there you have people who are starting to make a child pornographic material who would never have done that if they weren't sort of almost forced to be part of that community. And even worse, because that material can always be found on your computer, I think that the latest rage for people is to not download any material, but to actually watch a live stream of actual abuse, for the simple reason that it is impossible to detect that on your computer. So by making themselves less likely to be detected, they're actually making things worse. And that's the kind of damage that makes you worry about. How far should we go in trying to fight this if we make it worse? It keeps me awake sometimes.
Just want to inspired by you. I think the most current problem we have in Denmark right now is between school kids, because they on their phone they make a short video of one of their girlfriends and then distribute it to all the other kids in school. And we had several of those cases. So right now there is a lot of attention on how schools can prevent that kind of offense between school kids.
Yes.
And adding to that, that's a problem in the Netherlands as well, which is certainly rising. There is a new diversion program for young offenders who have done this sort of sexting, which is currently evaluated. And I think for young offenders who are peer offenders, probably not knowing the legal boundaries of that they are really producing child pornography, I think these early intervention, early diversion from the justice system is in the long end much better than convicting them, putting them on the sex offender registry lifelong, which is the case in the Netherlands. I mean, the register is not publicly accessible, but they are put on a register, and so they never, in their later life, they will not be able to work with children or any vulnerable people. So I think that's a good thing.
One of the things that we haven't talked about at the conference, but is an issue, and Brexit brings it to mind, freedom of movement and movement of people. Do you have any thoughts, or do you see any challenges around freedom of movement and what that means for managing people who commit sexual offenses?
I can tell something, and I think we have a lot of clients who are traveling in Europe, and we don't have any idea what they are doing in those other countries, and our possibilities to limit that are very restricted. We can do something regarding long-term leaves, meant for weekends and 1-2 days. You just get in a car and go wherever you want. And I have in mind one colleague. He's also shared. She told about her client who is sentenced in Latvia. His family is in Latvia, and he works in Czech Republic. And he most of the time he actually is there in Czech Republic. And in Latvia he goes to visit probation officer. Theoretically, there is possibility to transfer sanction, I understand, to the Czech Republic. Most probably there is, I think, yes. And but he don't want that. He better flies every week to Latvia to visit his probation officer here, and not because he very likes this, I think, probation officer. I think there could be something else behind that, but Czech authorities don't know. I think it's very high possibility that Czech authorities, police, doesn't know that this offender is actually living there, and we don't have any idea what he's doing there. We never attended his flats there, and we don't know people with whom he spends time there. And we tried to somehow solve this issue with United Kingdom, and say, that the framework decision 947 is not about sending everybody from United Kingdom back to Latvia, but we have many people who are sentenced here, but actually have the whole lives in United Kingdom. That we can send you information about them, we can inform you, but we need some kind of agreement about that. If you are not able to accept them through transfer, if you are not willing, and UK refused, and okay, if you don't want, if you write or exit Brexit, that's your choice, but that doesn't change that those sex offenders are in your country,
If we have free movement of people, you should also have exchange of information. And within Europe, for the very least within Europe. I mean, you can't help if people travel like child sex tourism, travel to Southeast Asia, and you don't really know what happens there. That's bad enough. But within Europe, I think we should be able. If you see how long it takes us for someone who has lived like in Germany, next door neighbors for most of his life, and then moves to the Netherlands and then commits an offense and gets into treatment, and we have to like ask, well, you have a convicted in Germany, and we have to depend on what he says, because there's like no way to find out. It doesn't cost 1 million years to get there, and I think that is really a bad thing. Yeah, I think we should do better within Europe and worldwide. I think this is one thing, child sex tourism, but the bottom line of it, of course, is wealth distribution. There's child abuse in poor countries, but there's also women abuse in poor countries. If people are very rich and they travel to very poor countries, they're gonna buy stuff that they cannot buy at home. And if you can buy everything you want, people will buy sex. It's that simple. So.
We have a problem with trafficking. Yes. Women coming from Africa and are sex workers in our countries, and we have difficulties really to follow these cases properly. I don't know yet.
And they move them around as well.
Yes.
Yes, we have that too, but we with COSA we also have good examples, because there is some contact between COSA projects in different countries. And as I remember well, Audrey, there was this example of a sex offender who was moving abroad. No, there was a volunteer who was working in Canada looking for a contact here because he knew that a sex offender was moving to the Netherlands. So international contacts, person to person, sometimes can help. It's not a solution to lack of information, but international contacts can help.
So the last question, which is obviously going to be the easiest question for you all to answer, is we have talked a lot about challenges and what's going on and the issues that we face. And, I want to be positive, and I think being positive is important. So what alternative strategies, what would you like to see introduced that you think could help us manage and work towards integrating people who have committed sexual offences back into communities?
Immediately into my mind comes, and that's a large discovery of this year, is Council of Europe has a recommendation on restorative justice. It was approved last month. I think it completely supports restorative justice practices as circles of support and accountability, and it broadens this view on a conflict in our society and how we can solve this. That solutions could be also not only criminal justice solutions, that there could be also other solutions. And I believe this strongly applies also to work with sexual offenses, violent offenses, every offense actually. It's just how we use the healing potential of that situation, how we take care of victims, take care in a correct way of offenders, or we call them in Latvia clients. Yes, in Latvia we have probation clients, not probation offenders or something like that. And when we go to meet our clients, we have ties sometimes. Now this is something I really recommend to read to everybody, this recommendation on restorative justice. I read it. I think this is revolutionary, and it will take some 5-10 years until we will actually understand why it is so important.
Yeah, I totally agree. For most sex offenders, punishment is enough for them to not recidivate. And the way that punishment works best, if someone is punished every time that he offends, so you have to catch them, invest in catching them, and catching them all as often as you can, and then deliver your punishment as quickly as you can, and then maybe have the punishment be related to the crime. So restorative justice is something that sounds really interesting to me as well. And then for rehabilitation, I doubt if you, like for the large group offenders, have to do that much, because if you take all kinds of precautions when a sex offender returns to town, if you take too many precautions, people will think like, oh, he must be really dangerous, that all of these precautions are necessary. So maybe sometimes you shouldn't do that much and just say, I think this is going to be okay, just let it be.
Well, I think the more we talk about sexual offenses, also about women who offend, because we see very few women offenders in our prison system. But when we talk to the sexual offenders, many of them tell us that in their background, in their childhood, they were abused by a woman. And we don't see these women in our system. So, or very few. So I think the more we talk about this in schools, in films, in discussions, in books, and so the less hidden the problem is, the better it is, because it can make people aware of, okay, my sexuality is risky right now. I have to seek help. Somebody here talked about anonymous helplines, and we have that in Denmark too. And I hope it will be used more than it is today. Yeah.
And I think also one of the problems is that a lot of victims are not going to the police to report the abuse. As Vinike said, we should catch as much as we can, because then the road to therapy, whatever, is open. But the reality is that 80 or 90% of the sex offenders never get there. They are sitting next to us on the couch in the evening. They are lying next to us in bed. They are never catched. 60% of the women who are victim of domestic abuse are also facing sexual abuse, are raped day in, day out. They are not always helped very well by the system, by the police, who not always believes their story, and we should invest in that as well, to support the victims to report these crimes to the police, and then help the police to understand the importance of catching the offender and getting him into a system for punishment or for therapy or whatever is necessary. Because for most offenders, this is the only way to get treated. Then they never will go by themselves to a therapist.
I don't really think they all need therapy, though. And to catch them isn't even always the judicial system. You just have to feel the consequences of what you do, even if it's only like your best friend saying, hey, man, that's not okay what you're doing there. I saw that and I don't agree with that. And losing friends or being judged by your friends can also be enough punishment for, and I'm not talking about like the high risk guys, but for the ordinary sex offender to say, okay, I'm not going there anymore. And I think we should all be very consistent in judging that behavior whenever we see it.
And, I think that this sort of draws this nicely to a close for today, because one of the challenges that we face in this field is about how do we make people aware that sexual abuse isn't a pathological problem, that actually people who commit sexual abuse and are victims of sexual abuse are in our families, in our neighborhoods, in our communities. And while we might want the person who commits sexual abuse to be the other, because that does a lot of social work for us, that makes us feel better, that reinforces that they're deviant and we are not. The Me Too movement, more than anything else, has really demonstrated that sexual abuse and sexual harassment are key parts of everyday life for most people. So, first of all, I would like to thank our panel for coming up to the front. Tomorrow, you're going to hear Vinike and you're going to hear Marianne talking about their work and what they're involved in. And I'm going to hand back over to Wilhelm to close the day.
Thank you.
Okay, we've come to an end of a, I think, very, well, intensive program. I find it very valuable, and I hope you do that too, and also useful for your practice. I've had some questions about what will happen this evening. Well, actually, the reception and the dinner will take place in the restaurant where you've already been. And then it comes to the most difficult question about the dinner. Is there a dress code? I've been in troubles before. Explaining, I was in an American situation with American delegates, defining what a casual business was. And we agreed on casual business, so all Americans, they arrived with a tie, and all Europeans did not wear a tie. The dress code, and I have to disappoint some people, will be informal, which means for some people there is no reason to run into town and to buy new shoes. I hope to see you all, well, in 15 minutes. And for the people who will go home, the Latvian colleagues, thank you for being here. Have a safe trip, and I hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you.